I am Jada, 35 years old, and I just destroyed my brother's $150,000 wedding without raising my voice once. I walked up to the gates of the Atlanta Botanical Garden, handed over my invitation, and was told I was banned from the property. When I called the groom to ask why, he laughed and told me to go home unless I was there to pay the florist. So I left. But the silver gift box I left behind for him ensured that by the time they cut the cake, his entire life was over. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off a toxic family member to protect your own peace. Growing up in Atlanta, Georgia meant my parents always cared more about looking good than being good. That obsession with appearances culminated on a sweltering Saturday afternoon in late June. I pulled my Porsche into the circular driveway of the Atlanta Botanical Garden. The venue was stunning, closed off entirely for a private event. Cascading floral arrangements of white orchids and imported hydrangeas spilled over the iron gates. Valets in crisp white shirts rushed to open car doors for politicians, local celebrities, and wealthy socialites. This was not just a wedding. This was my brother Kendrick's coronation. He was marrying Jasmine, a beautiful woman from one of the most prominent politically connected families in Georgia. I wore a custom emerald green silk gown. I had my hair perfectly styled. I looked the part of the successful, supportive older sister. I am a senior forensic accountant at a major corporate firm, meaning my entire life revolves around finding things people want to hide. My days are spent tracking offshore accounts, untangling wire fraud, and exposing corporate liars. But today, I just wanted to do my family duty, sit in the back, and eat the dry chicken. I walked up the stone pathway toward the grand entrance. A young event coordinator in a sleek black suit stood behind a velvet rope holding a tablet and a clipboard. She looked up and offered a bright customer service smile. I gave her my name, Jada, sister of the groom. I expected her to cross my name off and hand me a program. Instead, her smile faltered. She looked at the screen, swiped her finger, and then looked at a separate piece of paper clipped to the back of her board. Her face flushed with immediate discomfort. She cleared her throat and stepped slightly into my path. "I am so sorry, ma'am," she said, lowering her voice so the wealthy guests walking past us would not hear. "You have been explicitly placed on the do not entry list." I blinked. The summer heat pressed down on my shoulders, but I felt completely cold. I asked her to repeat herself. She looked terrified, but held her ground. "The groom gave us a specific list this morning. He said under no circumstances are you allowed inside the venue. He even provided a photo of you to the security team." I stood there as Jasmine's elegant aunts and uncles brushed past me, giving me strange looks. My own brother had weaponized the event staff against me. The sheer humiliation of it was designed to make me snap, to make me cause a scene, so they could point their fingers and call me the crazy, jealous sister. But my career relies on a cool head. Forensic accountants do not throw tantrums. We gather data. I stepped aside, moving out of the flow of the incoming guests. I stood under the shade of a massive oak tree and pulled out my phone. I dialed Kendrick's number. I honestly did not expect him to answer, but on the third ring, the line clicked open. The sound of a live string quartet drifted through the speaker, mingling with the clinking of champagne glasses and the low hum of expensive conversations. "Hello," Kendrick answered. His voice was dripping with that arrogant tech entrepreneur confidence he had completely fabricated. I kept my voice perfectly level. I told him I was standing at the front gate and asked why the event staff was treating me like a party crasher. Kendrick let out a sharp, mocking laugh that made my stomach turn. "Did you seriously think Jasmine's family wants the resentful spinster sister hovering around in the wedding photos?" he sneered. "Go home, Jada. You are embarrassing yourself just being there." Before I could formulate a response to the sheer audacity of his words, another voice pierced through the background of the call. It was loud, frantic, and unmistakably our mother Brenda. "If she did not bring the blank check for the florist's overtime, tell her to leave right now," Brenda shouted. She did not even care if I heard her. She wanted me to hear her. In that single echoing sentence, 20 years of family dynamics clicked into place with horrifying clarity. I was 35 years old, highly educated, fiercely independent, and completely invisible to them as a human being. To Brenda Jerome and my brother Kendrick, I was nothing more than an ATM machine that breathed. They had banned me from the ceremony to punish me for not blindly funding this charade, but they were still hoping I was desperate enough for their approval to stand outside the gates and write a check just to buy my way into the reception. They thought the threat of exclusion would break me. They thought I would cry, beg, and hand over my hard-earned money to save Kendrick from the financial disaster he had created. I thought about all the times Brenda had demanded I pay for Kendrick's rent because his imaginary business ventures needed more time to scale. I thought about how Jerome, our father, always told me to be the bigger person because Kendrick was the golden child destined for greatness, while my corporate accounting job was just practical. They had conditioned me my entire life to believe that my only value was my financial utility to my brother. From the time I got my first paycheck at 16, a portion of it was always demanded to cover Kendrick's mistakes. If he crashed his car, I was expected to empty my savings. If he blew his college fund on luxury clothes, I was expected to take out student loans to alleviate the burden on our parents. And here I was standing outside a botanical garden in a silk gown being held hostage by a florist's overtime bill for a wedding I was not even allowed to attend. The psychological manipulation was staggering. They had built this entire facade of immense wealth for Jasmine's family, pretending Kendrick was a wildly successful CEO, while simultaneously shaking down his own sister at the front gate. Kendrick was still on the phone waiting for me to break. He was waiting for the familiar sound of my surrender, the moment where I would offer to pay, just to be included in the family photos. "Are you still there?" he taunted. "If you have the check, leave it with the valet. Otherwise, take your little car and drive back to your empty apartment. Enjoy your Saturday." I did not yell. I did not hurl insults. I simply closed my eyes, took a deep breath of the floral-scented air, and smiled. The anger evaporated, replaced by a profound, icy calm. They had pushed me exactly 1 inch too far. They had no idea that I had spent the last 3 weeks auditing his entire fraudulent life. They had no idea what was sitting inside my designer handbag. I told him I understood perfectly. I told him to enjoy his special day. Then I ended the call. The silence that followed felt like the first breath of fresh air I had taken in 35 years. I turned back toward the event coordinator, who was still watching me with a mixture of pity and relief. I reached into my bag and pulled out a sleek, silver-wrapped box. I handed it to her along with a crisp $100 bill. "Just make sure this goes directly to the groom's table," I told her softly. "It is the only wedding present he will ever need." The young woman stared at the silver paper, then down at the crisp $100 bill I had slid under the ribbon. She nodded slowly, slipping the money into her blazer pocket. I could see the curiosity burning in her eyes, wondering what kind of sister gets turned away at the gates, but still tips $100 to deliver a gift. I did not wait around to offer an explanation. I turned on my heel and walked back down the stone pathway. Every step away from those iron gates felt like shedding a layer of a heavy, suffocating skin. For my entire adult life, I had contorted myself to fit into the tiny, miserable box my parents had assigned to me. I was the safety net. I was the backup plan. I was the silent bank account they could raid whenever my brother's delusions of grandeur outpaced his actual talent. But not anymore. I reached my car, slid into the driver's seat, and shut the door, sealing out the sounds of the string quartet and the valet attendants. The quiet interior of my Porsche felt like a sanctuary. I started the engine and pulled out of the circular driveway, merging onto the sunlit streets of Atlanta. I did not look back in the rearview mirror. There was no need. I already knew exactly what was happening behind those gates, and more importantly, I knew exactly what was going to happen in exactly 2 hours. Driving through the city, my mind shifted from the emotional weight of my family to the cold, hard logic of my profession. In forensic accounting, you learn very quickly that people lie, but numbers never do. Kendrick had spent the last 3 years spinning a web of deceit so massive and so intricate that it had practically become his reality. He actually believed he was the successful tech entrepreneur he pretended to be. My parents believed it too because they wanted to. It was easier to believe their golden child was a genius than to admit he was a parasite bleeding them dry. But a house built on stolen credit and forged signatures cannot stand forever. It just needs a gentle push in the right direction. And I had spent the last 3 weeks meticulously calculating the angle, the force, and the exact moment to deliver that push. I navigated through the upscale neighborhood of Buckhead, steering away from the chaotic energy of the wedding and toward a place of deliberate solitude. I pulled up to one of the most exclusive steakhouses in the city, a place known for its dimly lit mahogany interiors, impeccable service, and absolute discretion. I tossed my keys to the valet and walked inside. The air conditioning hit me like a cool wave, a sharp contrast to the stifling Georgia heat outside. The restaurant was nearly empty at this hour on a Saturday afternoon, exactly as I had planned. A hostess with a polite, measured smile greeted me and led me to a quiet corner booth in the bar area. The leather seating was rich and comfortable. The lighting was low and moody, casting long shadows across the polished wooden table. A bartender in a white coat approached silently. I ordered an expensive gin martini, very dry with a lemon twist, and a prime ribeye steak cooked medium rare. I did not need to look at the prices. I had earned every single dollar in my bank account, through years of grueling corporate audits, late nights, analyzing spreadsheets, and outsmarting some of the most corrupt executives in the financial sector. I was not the struggling, resentful spinster my brother had just mocked over the phone. I was a predator in my own right, and I had finally decided to stop letting my own blood treat me like prey. The bartender returned with my drink, placing it on a small linen coaster. I thanked him, took a slow sip, and felt the sharp botanical bite of the gin settle my nerves. Then I reached into my handbag and pulled out my phone. I placed it dead center on the dark wooden table screen facing up. It was currently 2:15 in the afternoon. The ceremony was likely wrapping up right now. Jasmine, beautiful and completely oblivious, was probably saying her vows, promising her life to a man who did not actually exist. Soon the guests would transition to the cocktail hour, and then to the grand reception hall for the 5-course dinner. And at exactly 4 o'clock, the automated fraud triggers I had initiated with 3 different major banking institutions would execute. I stared at the black screen of my phone, watching my faint reflection in the glass. This was the hardest part, the waiting. In my line of work, we call it the quiet before the freeze. When you lock down a massive financial ecosystem, there is a delay between the bank servers processing the freeze and the real-world consequences hitting the target. It is a silent execution. 1 minute, a person has access to hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen credit. The next minute, their plastic cards are nothing more than useless rectangles of plastic. Kendrick had structured his entire wedding around the illusion of infinite wealth. He had demanded the most expensive catering package, top-tier open bars, and a live band that charged by the hour. But what he did not realize was that high-end event vendors do not wait until Monday to run the final balances. They run the auto drafts midway through the event to ensure the funds clear before they serve the main course. It is standard industry practice to prevent wealthy clients from dining and dashing. At 4 o'clock, the catering company's final invoice for $35,000 would hit Kendrick's primary account, an account that was currently holding funds fraudulently acquired through a forged line of credit secured by his new father-in-law's assets. An account that, thanks to my comprehensive tip to the Federal Fraud Department, was flagged locked and completely frozen by the authorities. I took another sip of my martini. I thought about my mother, Brenda. I thought about the way her voice had sounded over the phone just an hour ago, demanding I pay the florist's overtime. She was so convinced of her own superiority, so secure in her position as the mother of the groom, dictating terms from her imaginary throne. She had spent my entire life teaching me that love was conditional and that my condition was compliance. Today she was going to learn a very different lesson about consequences. My steak arrived perfectly seared and smelling of garlic and rosemary. I ate slowly, savoring every bite, completely at peace with my surroundings. The restaurant played a soft jazz melody that felt like a private soundtrack to my victory. There was no guilt in my chest. There was no lingering doubt about whether I had done the right thing. You cannot heal in the same environment that broke you. And sometimes you cannot just walk away from the people who broke you. Sometimes you have to dismantle their power source so they can never drag you back into their darkness again. Kendrick had used our parents' retirement money to buy a temporary crown. He had used my name and my credit in the past to clean up his messes. He had tried to use Jasmine's family wealth to secure his future. He was a financial vampire, and I had just driven a stake through his bank accounts. The digital clock on the wall above the bar clicked to 3:45. The tension in the air seemed to thicken even though I was the only one who knew what was coming. I imagined the scene back at the botanical gardens. The guests would be finding their seats. The champagne would be flowing. Kendrick would be sitting at the sweetheart table feeling like a king, and sitting right in front of him, delivered by the event coordinator, would be my sleek, silver-wrapped box. I knew exactly what would happen when he opened it. He would assume it was a peace offering. He would think I had finally caved to the pressure, driven to a nearby bank, and brought him the blank check he demanded. He would tear the paper off with that greedy, entitled smirk on his face. He would open the lid, and he would find a manila folder containing 50 pages of irrefutable, legally binding documentation proving he was a federal criminal. 3:55. I finished my steak and motioned for the bartender to clear my plate. I asked for a black coffee. I wanted to be wide awake for this. 3:58. I stared at the phone. It sat perfectly still on the table. 3:59. I took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill my lungs. I was no longer the scapegoat. I was the architect of my own justice. 4:00. Nothing happened for a long, agonizing minute. I watched the second hand on my watch sweep in a silent circle. Then at exactly 4:00 and 3 minutes, the black screen of my phone suddenly illuminated, vibrating violently against the dark wood of the table. The fallout had officially begun. The vibration rattled my phone against the dark mahogany table, breaking the quiet jazz ambiance of the steakhouse. I looked down at the glowing screen. The caller ID displayed Kendrick's name in bold letters. It was exactly 4:00 and 3 minutes. The transition from the arrogant, untouchable groom who had just banned me from his wedding to a panicked man desperately calling his sister had taken exactly 2 hours. Right now, back at the botanical garden, the best man was probably supposed to be tapping a spoon against a crystal glass to give his speech. Instead, my brother was hiding in a corner or a bathroom stall, staring at his banking app in pure terror. I reached out and pressed the red decline button. The screen went dark. 2 seconds later, it lit up again. This time it was my mother, Brenda. I could almost picture her standing in her expensive mother-of-the-groom dress, her perfect makeup tightening into a scowl as she realized something was terribly wrong with the catering staff. I pressed decline again. Then came our father, Jerome. I let it ring twice before declining. Finally, Jasmine's name appeared on the screen. I felt a brief, sharp pang of sympathy for her. She was a pawn in all of this, an innocent woman who thought she was marrying a successful tech entrepreneur, completely unaware that she was tethering her life to a financial criminal. I declined her call too. She needed to learn the truth from the silver box I had left, not from me over the phone. When they realized I was not going to answer their calls, the text messages started pouring in. The notification chimes pinged rapidly, one after another, an overwhelming digital barrage of panic. I picked up the phone, unlocked the screen, and read the messages out loud to the empty space of my booth. The first cluster was from Kendrick. His words were a frantic spiral of confusion and rage. He wrote, "Pick up the phone right now. The caterers are packing up the food. My cards are declining, every single one of them." "What did you do?" The wedding planner says the final vendor drafts bounced. The band is threatening to leave. Answer me right now. He still did not understand the magnitude of what was happening. He probably thought I had simply called his banks and reported his cards stolen out of petty revenge. He thought this was a temporary glitch, a minor hurdle he could bully me into fixing. Then came the messages from Brenda. True to form, she did not ask what was going on or try to understand the situation. She went straight to blaming me. She texted, "How could you do this to your brother? You ruined his life. You ruined his special day over your own petty jealousy. Fix this right now or never speak to us again." I sat back in the leather booth and took a slow sip of my coffee. The irony of her words was astounding. She accused me of ruining his life, completely blind to the fact that Kendrick had ruined his own life the moment he decided to commit federal wire fraud. I was not the villain here. I was the consequence. And my family had never been introduced to consequences before. I set my coffee cup down and opened the photo gallery on my phone. I scrolled to an image I had saved 2 days ago. It was a clear, high-resolution screenshot of the official federal fraud freeze order confirmation. It was the digital death warrant for Kendrick's fake empire, complete with the case number, the banking institutional codes, and the mandate that all assets under his name were locked, pending a federal investigation. I attached the screenshot to a group chat containing Kendrick, Brenda, and Jerome. I did not add any dramatic text. I did not type out a long explanation or a vindictive message. The document spoke entirely for itself. I hit send. I watched the progress bar slide across the screen, confirming the image had been delivered to all three of them. I imagined the exact moment they opened it. I imagined Kendrick's face draining of all color as he read the words "federal investigation." I imagined Brenda's haughty anger instantly evaporating into sheer, unadulterated dread. As soon as the message said delivered, I went into my phone settings and switched the device to completely silent. No vibrations, no ringtones, no notifications. I placed the phone face down on the table, silencing my family once and for all. For the first time in my life, I was entirely in control of the narrative. But to understand how we reached this point of absolute destruction, you have to understand who I am and what I do. As I mentioned earlier, I am a senior forensic accountant. People hear the word accountant, and they think of taxes, boring spreadsheets, and calculators. But forensic accounting is entirely different. My job is essentially financial detective work. I am hired by major corporations' legal teams and sometimes federal agencies to track missing money, uncover embezzlement, and expose people who are living lies. I follow the paper trail. I find the hidden accounts, the forged signatures, and the offshore transfers. I destroy carefully constructed financial illusions for a living. My family knew this. They knew exactly what I did for a living, but they always belittled my career because it was not as flashy as being a tech entrepreneur. They underestimated me. They thought I was just the quiet sister who sat at a desk all day. They never stopped to consider that you should absolutely never steal from, lie to, or attempt to manipulate a woman whose entire career is built on dismantling liars. To see exactly how Kendrick built this house of cards and how I gathered the evidence to burn it down, we have to rewind to exactly 3 months earlier. It was a cool evening in early March. The setting was another upscale restaurant not too far from where I am sitting now. It was the official engagement dinner for Kendrick and Jasmine. Jasmine's parents, the wealthy and politically connected family that they are, had flown in from out of state to officially meet Brenda and Jerome. They had rented out a private dining room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. The atmosphere that night was suffocatingly pretentious. Brenda was wearing a designer dress she could not afford, laughing too loudly at every joke Jasmine's father made. Jerome was swirling a glass of expensive bourbon, nodding along as Kendrick held court at the head of the table. Kendrick was in rare form that night. He was wearing a custom-tailored suit and a Rolex watch that I immediately recognized as a new addition. He was loudly boasting about his so-called tech startup. He threw around buzzwords like algorithm scalable infrastructure and angel investors with the confidence of a man who had actually built something. Jasmine looked at him with pure adoration, and her parents seemed cautiously impressed. Then came the moment that started it all. The discussion turned to the wedding plans. Jasmine's father, a practical and traditional man, offered to pay for the venue and the major expenses. It was a generous offer standard for a family of their stature. But Kendrick, driven by his massive ego and his desperate need to prove he was a heavy hitter, waved his hand dismissively. "Absolutely not!" Kendrick announced, his voice carrying across the quiet room. "I will not have you paying for our big day, sir. My company just closed our Series A funding round. Business is booming. I am covering the entire reception. I want Jasmine to have the wedding of her dreams, and I want to be the one to give it to her." Brenda beamed with pride, reaching over to squeeze Kendrick's hand. Jerome raised his glass in a toast to his successful son. I sat quietly at the end of the table, sipping my water. I knew exactly how much an event of that magnitude would cost in Atlanta. We were talking easily over $150,000. And I knew for an absolute fact that Kendrick did not have a Series A funding round because his company did not actually have a product. But I kept my mouth shut. I assumed he was just posturing and that he would eventually quietly accept Jasmine's parents' money behind closed doors. I had no intention of getting involved in his delusions. Until the waiter brought the bill for the engagement dinner. The waiter stepped to the head of the table, placing the sleek black leather folio discreetly near Jasmine's father. Roland, a man who had built formidable wealth in real estate and local politics, immediately reached for it, with the casual authority of a patriarch accustomed to picking up the check. But Kendrick was faster. He snatched the folio with a theatrical swoop, pulling a heavy metallic platinum card from his designer wallet and dropping it onto the bill with a loud, deliberate clack. "I told you Roland tonight is entirely on me," Kendrick insisted, flashing a smile that was a little too wide, a little too practiced. "This is a celebration of our families joining together. I would not dream of letting you pay." Roland withdrew his hand slowly, his expression utterly unreadable. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, resting his forearms on the white linen tablecloth. "Very generous of you, Kendrick." Roland said, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that commanded the room. "Though I must admit, I am quite curious about this Series A funding round you mentioned earlier. The tech sector is incredibly volatile right now. Who exactly is leading your investment group?" The air in the private dining room seemed to shift. It was a perfectly reasonable question from a future father-in-law, but to someone like Kendrick, it was a direct threat. Kendrick did not miss a beat in his tone, but I saw his eyes dart toward the window for a fraction of a second. It was a classic tell. "Oh, we have several silent partners," Kendrick replied smoothly, leaning back in his chair and swirling his wine. "High net worth individuals who prefer to stay entirely out of the press. We are focusing heavily on disruptive algorithms in the global logistics space. Our proprietary software is going to revolutionize supply chain management. But you understand, it is highly classified until our beta launch next quarter. Disruptive algorithms, logistics space, beta launch." It was a spectacular word salad. Sitting at the far end of the table, I almost let out a laugh. As a forensic accountant, I knew exactly what a successful startup founder sounded like. They talked about tangible burn rates, customer acquisition costs, regulatory hurdles, and verifiable revenue streams. Kendrick sounded like someone who had binge-watched motivational business podcasts for a weekend and memorized all the buzzwords without understanding a single one of them. He was selling vaporware to a room full of people and banking on the fact that no one would ask to see the actual code. Roland took a slow, measured sip of his bourbon. He was not a fool. You do not amass his level of wealth and political influence without developing a highly attuned radar for nonsense. Disruptive. Roland repeated the word, rolling off his tongue with a subtle, razor-sharp edge. Fascinating. It is always interesting to see young men take such massive risks. My daughter has always preferred stability, so this entrepreneurial spirit of yours is quite a change of pace for her. This was the exact moment my parents sprang into action. They were like a highly trained crisis management team, always ready to run interference the second anyone dared to question their golden child. Brenda leaned across the table, her diamond earrings catching the warm glow of the chandelier. "Oh, Kendrick has always been an absolute visionary," Brenda gushed, waving her manicured hand dismissively at Roland's subtle skepticism. "Ever since he was a little boy, his mind just worked differently than everyone else's. He is a risk-taker. He is a natural leader. He is simply not meant to be chained to a desk doing menial work like some people." She did not even look at me when she said it, but the implication hung incredibly heavy in the air. The temperature in the room felt like it dropped 10 degrees. Jerome chuckled heartily, swirling the expensive red wine in his crystal glass. "Exactly," my father added, steering the conversation directly toward his favorite subject, which was putting me in my place. "Take Jada, for example. She is doing just fine for herself. Very stable, very predictable. She sits in a little cubicle, crunches numbers for other people's companies, and collects her bi-weekly paycheck. It is a nice, safe, boring little life. But Kendrick is out there creating the future. He is building a massive legacy." I sat there carefully cutting a piece of roasted asparagus, my face an absolute mask of professional neutrality. I did not work in a cubicle. I had a massive corner office overlooking the Atlanta skyline. I did not just crunch numbers. I uncovered multinational corporate fraud and testified as an expert witness in federal court. My safe little life came with a mid-six-figure salary, an immaculate credit score, and a professional reputation that made corrupt corporate executives sweat when I walked into their boardrooms. But to my parents, my career was nothing more than a boring pedestrian chore. I was just the background character in the grand sweeping movie of Kendrick's life. My stability was only useful to them when they needed someone to co-sign a lease or cover a sudden financial shortfall. Jasmine, bless her heart, sensed the sudden toxicity and tried to diffuse the awkwardness. She smiled warmly down the table at me. "Jada's job sounds incredibly important," Jasmine said softly. "I was reading about forensic accounting the other day. It takes a brilliant mind to track all those complex financial webs and follow the money. I think it is fascinating work." Brenda let out a sharp, condescending laugh that grated against my nerves. "Oh, Jasmine, sweetie, it is really just glorified bookkeeping with a fancy title. She looks at spreadsheets all day long. It is nothing special. Kendrick is the one dealing with complex webs. You should hear the tremendous stress he is under managing a whole team of software developers and pitching to venture capitalists." Kendrick puffed out his chest, looking incredibly pleased with himself. I looked at him and saw right through the custom-tailored suit and the expensive haircut. I saw the 20-something kid who used to beg me to write his college term papers because he was too hungover to do it himself. I saw the boy who had stolen my graduation money to pay off a sports betting debt. Now he was a 32-year-old man playing a highly dangerous game of financial dress-up with real-world consequences. Roland, however, was not easily distracted by Brenda's deflections. He turned his intense, calculating gaze back to Kendrick. "A team of developers implies a significant monthly payroll," Roland noted casually, "and funding a $150,000 wedding out of pocket while simultaneously scaling a tech startup is quite a financial feat. Are you absolutely sure you do not want us to handle the reception, Kendrick? I would hate for your new business to suffer severe cash flow issues just to throw a party." It was a polite, fatherly offer on the surface, but underneath the velvet tone, it was a rigorous test. Roland was testing the structural integrity of Kendrick's ego. Kendrick failed the test instantly. His pride flared up completely, masking the sheer panic that I could see flashing in his eyes. "I appreciate the concern, Roland, but my cash flow is more than fine." Kendrick lied effortlessly. "The wedding is completely handled. In fact, I have already secured the most exclusive caterer in the state and paid the initial deposits. I want everything to be absolutely perfect for Jasmine. No compromises whatsoever. No compromises." The phrase echoed endlessly in my head. I knew for a mathematical fact that Kendrick did not have $50,000 in liquid assets, let alone the $150,000 he was casually promising to spend on one night. Where was the money coming from? I looked over at my parents. They were nodding along, practically glowing with blind pride. Did they know he was completely broke? Or had he managed to con them just as thoroughly as he was conning Jasmine's family? The conversation slowly drifted toward the floral arrangements and the massive guest list, leaving the financial interrogation behind for the moment. But the psychological damage was done. The tension at the table remained palpable, hidden just beneath the surface of the polite laughter and the clinking of heavy silverware. I watched Roland carefully. He was nodding politely at Jasmine's enthusiastic descriptions of the botanical garden venue, but his eyes were sharp and unyielding. He did not trust Kendrick, and as a professional auditor, neither did I. For the next 20 minutes, I sat in silence, observing the entire disastrous dynamic play out. Kendrick continued to dominate the conversation, offering unsolicited, entirely incorrect advice on commercial real estate to Roland, a man who literally owned half the commercial properties in the business district. My parents continued to act as his personal cheerleaders, aggressively defending his every word and occasionally throwing a passive-aggressive insult my way to ensure everyone at the table remembered my place at the bottom of the family hierarchy. It was mentally exhausting. It was the exact same script we had been reading from for decades. Kendrick is the shining star. Jada is the invisible stagehand. Kendrick takes the glorious risks. Jada quietly cleans up the devastating messes. I finished my sparkling water and gently placed the crystal glass back on the table. I was already mentally calculating how quickly I could politely excuse myself after dessert was served. I had a massive complex audit file waiting for me at my apartment, and dealing with my family's collective delusions was rapidly draining my energy. I figured the night was essentially over. Kendrick had successfully dodged Roland's probing questions. My parents had gotten their chance to show off their golden child, and Jasmine was blissfully happy. All that was left was for the waiter to return with the receipt, Kendrick to sign it with a dramatic flourish, and everyone to go their separate ways. But my profession has taught me that the universe has a very funny way of stepping in when arrogant people push their lies just a little too far. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed the waiter approaching our private room. He was not walking with the brisk, confident stride of a server about to hand over a finalized bill to a wealthy patron. His steps were slow, his posture was rigid. He held the black leather folio tight against his chest, and his eyes darted nervously toward our table. As a forensic accountant, I am highly trained to spot subtle anomalies in human behavior. People act a certain way when a transaction goes smoothly, and they act a very specific, highly uncomfortable way when they have to deliver bad news involving money. The waiter reached the edge of our table. He did not go to the head of the table where Kendrick was sitting. Instead, he hesitated, standing awkwardly near the corner, where I was seated right next to my mother, waiting for a break in the conversation. The waiter finally caught Kendrick's eye. Kendrick was in the middle of a loud story about optimizing synergy, but he paused, looking annoyed at the interruption. The waiter leaned down, bringing his face close to Kendrick's ear. He spoke in a whisper, but the acoustics of the private room and my close proximity meant I caught every single word. "I am so sorry, sir," the waiter murmured, his voice tight with professional embarrassment. "The card you provided has been declined by the institution. Do you happen to have another form of payment?" Kendrick stopped mid-sentence. The confident, wealthy tech founder mask he had worn all night slipped, revealing the panicked, overextended boy underneath. His jaw clenched. He patted the chest pocket of his suit jacket, then reached into his trousers, performing a highly exaggerated pantomime of searching for a wallet he already knew was empty. "Oh, that is incredibly frustrating," Kendrick said, raising his voice just enough for the people at our end of the table to hear, but keeping it low enough that Roland and Jasmine, who were engaged in conversation at the far end, would not notice. "My bank puts an automatic fraud lock on my corporate card if the charge is out of my usual spending zip code. It is a security feature for high net worth accounts. Let me just call my wealth manager tomorrow and clear this up." It was a pathetic excuse, but Brenda swallowed it whole. Or rather, she pretended to swallow it whole to maintain the illusion. Her eyes darted nervously toward Roland. She knew the waiter standing there holding a black folio meant disaster. If Roland realized Kendrick could not even afford a $2,000 dinner bill, the entire $150,000 wedding charade would collapse before dessert was even cleared. Suddenly, I felt a sharp, agonizing pain in my left shin. I flinched, biting the inside of my cheek to keep from making a sound. Brenda had kicked me under the table. The heel of her designer shoe dug into my leg as she leaned toward me, pretending to admire the floral centerpiece. Her voice was a venomous hiss, completely at odds with the fake smile plastered on her face. "Cover it," Brenda commanded through gritted teeth. "Give the man your card right now. Do not humiliate your brother in front of Jasmine's people." I looked at my mother. I looked at the sheer desperation hiding behind her manicured exterior. She was willing to physically assault me under a dining table to protect her son's fragile ego. A younger version of me, the one who still desperately craved my parents' approval, would have scrambled to pull out her wallet, eager to play the hero and save the family from embarrassment. But the 35-year-old forensic accountant, sitting in that chair, operated on a completely different frequency. I did not pull out my card to save Kendrick. I pulled it out because I wanted the paper trail. In my line of work, we call it buying the evidence. If I paid the bill, the transaction became mine, and I would get the merchant copy of the receipts. I smoothly reached into my clutch, pulled out my own heavy metal credit card, and discreetly handed it to the waiter. "Just put it on this one, please," I said quietly. The waiter looked immensely relieved to be rescued from the awkward standoff. He took my card and vanished from the room. Kendrick let out a long, quiet breath. He did not thank me. He did not even look at me. He simply picked up his wine glass, took a large swallow, and immediately pivoted back to his conversation with Jerome, complaining about the overly aggressive fraud algorithms at his bank. Brenda gave me a curt, dismissive nod, acting as if I had merely fulfilled my basic biological purpose for existing. The crisis was averted. The golden child was safe. The wealthy future-in-laws were none the wiser. 10 minutes later, the waiter returned. He approached my side of the table this time, placing the black leather folio gently next to my water glass. "Thank you, ma'am," he whispered, giving me a respectful nod, before stepping away to help clear the dessert plates. I opened the folio to sign the slip and add the tip, but in his haste to process the new payment, the waiter had made a small administrative error. Tucked directly beneath my approved receipt was the original declined merchant slip from Kendrick's attempt. I slid the small piece of thermal paper out from under my receipt. It was a standard restaurant point-of-sale printout. It listed the time, the date, the total amount of $2,140, and the bold capitalized word, "declined," across the bottom. But it was the sequence of numbers near the top of the slip that made my blood run absolutely cold. It displayed the card brand and the last 4 digits of the account number, 3801. As a numbers person, I have a photographic memory for financial data. I do not just remember my own accounts. I remember routing numbers, tax identification numbers, and account sequences for anyone I have ever done financial favors for. 5 years ago, when Jerome was hospitalized for a minor heart issue, Brenda was too panicked to handle their bills. She had given me their financial files and asked me to set up auto-pay for their utilities. I had spent 3 days organizing their entire financial life. I recognized the sequence 3801 immediately. It was not a corporate business account. It was not a high-net-worth startup ledger. It was Brenda and Jerome's joint retirement account. I stared at the slip of paper, the ambient noise of the restaurant fading into a dull roar in my ears. I felt a sudden wave of genuine nausea. Kendrick had not handed the waiter a company card. He had handed the waiter our parents' retirement debit card, and it had declined for insufficient funds. My mind began working at a terrifying speed, connecting the dots that my parents were either too blind or too stupid to see. Kendrick was 32 years old. He drove a leased sports car that cost over $100,000. He wore bespoke suits. He was currently planning a wedding that would easily cost $150,000. And he was paying for the engagement dinner with a retirement account that had just hit a hard limit at a mere $2,000. They were broke. My parents were completely unequivocally broke, and Kendrick had bled them dry. I looked down the table at Brenda and Jerome. They were laughing at something Jasmine had said, their faces flushed with wine and pride. They were sitting in a private dining room, toasting to their son's imaginary empire, completely unaware that their own financial foundation had just collapsed underneath them. Or worse, they were fully aware, and they were actively enabling his fraud, hoping Jasmine's family wealth would eventually bail them all out. I folded the declined receipt into a tiny square and slipped it into the hidden pocket of my designer clutch. I signed my own receipt, leaving a generous 30% tip for the waiter who had inadvertently handed me the key to my family's darkest secret. I closed the black folio and pushed it toward the center of the table. The dinner dragged on for another 30 minutes, but I was no longer present in the room. My brain had fully shifted into forensic mode. The emotional sister who felt hurt and overlooked was gone. In her place was the senior auditor, cold, calculating, and hungry for the truth. If Kendrick was draining our parents' retirement, where was the rest of the money coming from? A drained retirement account explained the lavish dinners and the suits, but it did not explain how he had secured the venue for the wedding. It did not explain how he was affording the deposits for the florists, the caterers, and the luxury honeymoon to the Maldives. A man whose card declines for $2,000 does not casually write a check for $150,000 unless he has found another far more dangerous source of capital. The moment the valet brought my car around to the front of the restaurant, I said my polite goodbyes. I hugged Jasmine, shook Roland's hand, and let my parents give me their hollow, performative cheek kisses. Kendrick slapped me on the shoulder, flashing that arrogant grin. "Thanks for covering the tab, Jada," he said, completely devoid of actual gratitude. "I will have my accounting department wire you the reimbursement on Monday." I looked him dead in the eye. "Do not worry about it, Kendrick," I said softly. "Consider it an early wedding gift." I got into my car and drove straight to my apartment in the city. I did not bother changing out of my dress. I walked directly into my home office, turned on my multiple monitors, and booted up my secure terminal. I pulled the tiny folded receipt out of my clutch and flattened it on my desk. 3801. The thread had been pulled. Now it was time to unravel the entire sweater. It was time to audit my own brother. I sat in the ergonomic chair of my home office, the glow from 332-inch monitors casting a pale blue light across the room. I smoothed out the thermal receipt I had smuggled from the restaurant and placed it flat on my desk. 3801. That 4-digit sequence was the thread. Now it was time to pull it and watch my brother's entire life unravel. When people think of auditing, they imagine a boring process of checking receipts against ledgers. But forensic accounting is not about doing math. It is about understanding human behavior. Money is energy. It leaves a footprint every single time it moves. If you know where to look, you can rebuild a person's entire life, their secrets and their sins, just by following the digital breadcrumbs they leave behind. I did not need to hack into anything illegal. Desperate people leave massive trails in public records, corporate registries, and property databases. You just need to have the clearance and the intellect to read the metadata. I started with the company. Kendrick had been throwing around the term disruptive logistics all night. I accessed the state corporate registry database and typed in his name. He had registered a limited liability company called Nexus Global Operations exactly 9 months ago, right around the time he started seriously dating Jasmine. I pulled the incorporation documents. There was no board of directors, there were no silent partners. There was only one name listed under the managing member: Kendrick. The registered business address was not a sleek downtown high-rise. I pulled up the location on satellite mapping. It was a virtual mailbox located inside a dilapidated strip mall shipping center next to a dry cleaner. I typed the company name into a domain registry tool to find his website. It was a beautiful, responsive site filled with stock photos of cargo ships and people in business suits pointing at graphs. But a quick reverse image search revealed he had bought a $50 website template. There was no actual product, there was no software. The proprietary algorithm he had bragged about to Roland was a complete fabrication. Nexus Global Operations was a ghost ship. It existed solely on paper to give him a job title. With the startup illusion shattered, I turned my attention to the sequence 3801. This was the retirement account my parents had spent 40 years building. My father had worked middle management at a shipping firm, and my mother had been a dental hygienist. They were not wealthy, but they had been comfortable. When I helped them organize their finances 5 years ago, that account held roughly $400,000. It was supposed to be their safety net for old age. To understand what was happening with that account without committing a cybercrime by logging in directly with their credentials, I ran a comprehensive public records check on Jerome and Brenda. As a licensed professional, I have legal access to credit reporting aggregates and property lien databases. I entered their social security numbers, which I had memorized years ago. The results populated on my screen in a matter of seconds, and the sheer volume of red flags made my chest tighten. In the last 12 months, my parents had taken out a massive home equity line of credit against the house I grew up in. Their credit utilization ratio, which I had painstakingly brought down to a healthy 10% years ago, was now maxed out across 7 different premium credit cards. But the most damning piece of evidence was the tax records. To withdraw massive amounts from a retirement account before the legal age limit, you trigger severe federal tax penalties. The public tax lien database showed my parents had recently been flagged for unpaid early withdrawal penalties. They had completely liquidated their retirement. Why would they do that? They had no medical emergencies. They had not bought a vacation home. The money had simply vanished. Or rather, it had been funneled directly into the black hole of Kendrick's ego. I opened a blank spreadsheet and began building a timeline. This is where the forensic puzzle pieces clicked together. In column A, I listed the major milestones of Kendrick's relationship with Jasmine. The month they met, the month they moved into a luxury high-rise apartment together, the month he bought her a 3-carat diamond engagement ring. In column B, I listed the financial anomalies tied to my parents. The dates of the home equity loan, the dates the tax penalties were triggered, the dates the credit cards were maxed out. The 2 columns mirrored each other perfectly. It was a flawless, devastating correlation. When Kendrick met Jasmine, he realized he was out of his league. Jasmine came from generational wealth. She was accustomed to a certain standard of living surrounded by successful, driven people. Kendrick knew that his reality, a 32-year-old man with a string of failed ventures and no actual income, would never impress her. He needed a disguise. He needed to become the kind of man Jasmine's family would respect. So he turned to his ultimate enablers. He convinced our parents that he was on the verge of a massive breakthrough. He spun a story about needing seed money, bridge capital, and lifestyle investments to network with the right venture capitalists. And Brenda and Jerome, blinded by their desperate need for Kendrick to be a genius, gave him the keys to their financial kingdom. I pulled up Kendrick's social media accounts on my third monitor. His feed was a carefully curated exhibition of immense wealth. I cross-referenced every flex with the public databases. He posted a photo leaning against a brand-new Porsche 911. I ran the license plate through a vehicle registration database. It was not owned by his company. It was a high-mileage commercial lease with a staggering monthly payment, and the primary guarantor was Jerome. He posted photos from a luxury ski vacation in Aspen. I checked the dates against the credit card spikes on my parents' profile. They had funded the trip. The bespoke suits, the VIP tables at nightclubs, the expensive dinners at places like the steakhouse I had just left. It was all a mirage paid for by the blood and sweat of our parents' working years. Kendrick had not built a business. He had built a Ponzi scheme, and his only investors were his own mother and father. I sat back in my chair staring at the spreadsheet. The sheer sociopathy of it all was breathtaking. Kendrick was not just irresponsible, he was a predator. He was willing to let our parents die in poverty, just so he could wear a Rolex and pretend to be a titan of industry for a few years. And my parents were willing participants, allowing themselves to be financially slaughtered on the altar of his ego. A small bitter part of me wanted to laugh. For my entire life, Brenda and Jerome had treated me like a disappointment because I chose a safe, boring corporate job. They had constantly compared my steady, predictable income to Kendrick's imaginary millions. They had looked down on me from a pedestal built entirely on their own stolen retirement funds. But as the initial shock wore off, the cold, analytical part of my brain took over again. I looked at the totals on my screen. I looked at the math. And the math was not making sense. My parents had perhaps $400,000 to $500,000 in total accessible equity and retirement savings when this started. Between the luxury apartment, rent the Porsche lease, the designer wardrobe, the vacations, and the massive diamond ring, Kendrick had burned through almost all of it over the last 12 months. The declined card at the restaurant tonight proved that the well was finally dry. The 3801 account was empty. Which brought me to a terrifying question. If my parents were completely broke and Kendrick had no actual income, how was he paying for the wedding? A wedding at the Atlanta Botanical Garden with premium catering, open bars, custom floral installations, and a live 12-piece band required massive, non-refundable deposits. We were talking about $50,000 to $60,000 just to secure the date and another $100,000 due the week of the event. A declined debit card could not cover that. A maxed-out home equity line of credit could not cover that. Kendrick had found another source of money, a massive liquid source of capital that had to be untraceable enough to fool Jasmine's family, but accessible enough for him to wire to wedding vendors. I cracked my knuckles, the sound sharp in the quiet room. I closed the public records tabs and opened my specialized forensic tracing software. If the money did not come from our parents, and it did not come from his fake company, there was only one other place a man like Kendrick could extract that kind of cash. He had to have leveraged someone else's assets. I typed Roland's name into the search bar. I needed to see if Kendrick had somehow managed to tap into his future father-in-law's empire. I initiated a deep dive into recent commercial credit inquiries, corporate loan filings, and secured collateral registries in the state of Georgia. The progress bar on my screen slowly crawled forward, analyzing thousands of financial data points. I took a sip of my cold coffee, my eyes locked on the monitor. What I was about to find would take Kendrick from a manipulative son draining his parents to a man facing decades in federal prison. The illusion was about to become a felony. The progress bar on my secure terminal hit 100%, and the screen flashed with a soft green indicator. A notification chime broke the heavy silence of my home office. My specialized tracing software had successfully penetrated the layers of state corporate registries and commercial lending databases. The results populated in a neat chronological list of financial filings associated with both Kendrick's fake company and Roland's real estate empire. I scrolled past the standard public records and focused entirely on the commercial credit inquiries. My eyes scanned the lines of data until they locked onto a massive anomaly. My breath hitched in my throat. Exactly 3 weeks ago, Nexus Global Operations had secured a massive commercial line of credit. The issuing institution was a mid-sized regional bank known for aggressive corporate lending. I clicked on the digital file expanding the details of the loan origination. The total approved credit limit was $250,000. I sat back and stared at the number. $250,000. It was the exact amount of capital required to fund a luxury wedding at the Atlanta Botanical Garden, secure a 5-star honeymoon, and keep up the illusion of a wealthy lifestyle for at least another 6 months. Kendrick had found his cash. But as a forensic accountant, I knew that banks do not simply hand over $250,000 to a 9-month-old shell company with a virtual mailbox and absolutely zero verifiable revenue. To secure a loan of that magnitude, you need collateral. You need a guarantor with an immaculate financial history and substantial liquid assets to back the risk. I leaned forward, my face inches from the monitor, and opened the Uniform Commercial Code financing statement attached to the loan. This is the legal document that publicly declares a lender's right to seize assets if a borrower defaults. I scrolled down to the guarantor section, my heart pounding a heavy rhythmic beat against my ribs. There, listed as the primary guarantor and sole collateral provider for Nexus Global Operations, was Roland's primary family trust. A wave of absolute disgust washed over me. Kendrick had not just tapped into Jasmine's family wealth, he had secretly leveraged it. The loan was secured against a prime piece of commercial real estate in downtown Atlanta, a warehouse district owned entirely by Roland's trust. If Kendrick defaulted on this line of credit, which was a mathematical certainty, considering he had no actual income to make the monthly payments, the regional bank would have the legal authority to place a lien on Roland's property and seize it. I needed to see the signatures. I needed to see exactly how Kendrick had pulled off a fraud of this magnitude without raising any alarms at the bank. I initiated a secure request to pull the digitized copies of the original loan application. It took 3 agonizing minutes for the heavily encrypted PDF to download to my local server. When the file finally opened, I scrolled directly to the final page of the guarantor agreement. There were 2 signatures at the bottom of the page. The first was Kendrick's, signed with his usual arrogant, sweeping cursive under the title of Chief Executive Officer. The second signature belonged to Roland, authorizing the pledge of his family trust as collateral. I pulled up a separate window on my second monitor and accessed the county property deed registry. Roland was a high-profile real estate developer, meaning his actual legally verified signature was readily available on dozens of public property deeds. I downloaded a recent deed and placed the 2 windows side by side, magnifying both signatures to 200%. To the untrained eye, the signature on the loan document looked perfect. But I do not have an untrained eye. I spend my life analyzing documents for corporate litigation. When a human being signs their name, there are natural variations in the pressure of the pen. The ink pools slightly where the hand pauses, and the strokes taper off organically at the ends of the letters. The signature on Kendrick's loan document had none of those natural variations. The line weight was entirely uniform. There were microscopic pixelation artifacts around the edges of the ink. It was not a physical signature. It was a high-quality digital lift. I closed my eyes and pictured the engagement dinner we had just left. I remembered Kendrick boasting about his startup. I remembered him mentioning that he had silent partners and highly classified proprietary algorithms. And then I remembered a tiny detail from a conversation I had overheard between Kendrick and Jasmine a month ago. Kendrick had proudly told Jasmine that he had asked her father to sign a non-disclosure agreement before he shared the intricate details of his business model, claiming it was standard industry practice. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Kendrick had manufactured that entire scenario. He had printed a fake non-disclosure agreement, handed it to Roland under the guise of protecting his imaginary intellectual property, and watched the man sign it. Then Kendrick had taken that document, scanned it into his computer, digitally isolated Roland's signature, and superimposed it onto a $250,000 commercial loan application. He was not just a lazy, manipulative son anymore. He was a federal criminal. What he had done constituted aggravated identity theft, wire fraud, and bank fraud. In the United States, defrauding a financial institution carries a maximum penalty of up to 30 years in federal prison. And Kendrick had done it solely to pay for a wedding, to stroke his own massive ego. I thought about the way he had acted at the restaurant tonight. He had sat at the head of the table, wearing a custom suit paid for by my parents' drained retirement fund. He had boldly offered to pay the $2,000 dinner bill with a debit card he knew was running on fumes. And when the card declined, he had effortlessly lied to Roland's face, the very man whose financial identity he had just stolen to fund the entire charade. The sheer, unadulterated sociopathy required to execute a con like that was staggering. He felt no remorse. He felt no fear. He genuinely believed he was smarter than everyone else in the room. He believed that once he married Jasmine, he would simply merge his fake company with Roland's real empire, use his new father-in-law's money to quietly pay off the fraudulent loan, and no one would ever be the wiser. He thought he could manipulate reality itself, but he forgot about the forensic accountant sitting at the end of the table. I pushed my chair back from the desk and stood up, pacing the length of my home office. The adrenaline was coursing through my veins, sharpening my focus into a razor edge. The family dynamic that had suffocated me for 35 years was suddenly irrelevant. The blatant favoritism, the snide comments, the constant financial demands from my mother, none of it mattered anymore because the stakes had just escalated from toxic family drama to federal indictments. I walked over to my heavy-duty laser printer and turned it on. The machine whirred to life with a low, steady hum. I sat back down at my terminal and began compiling the master file. I did not just print the fraudulent loan application. I printed everything. I printed the state registry documents proving Nexus Global Operations was a shell company. I printed the public tax lien records showing my parents had liquidated their retirement accounts. I printed the vehicle registration proving the Porsche was a commercial lease guaranteed by my father. And finally, I printed the side-by-side forensic comparison of Roland's real signature and the digital forgery Kendrick had used to secure the $250,000 credit line. Page after page slid out of the printer, warm to the touch. Each piece of paper was a nail in the coffin of Kendrick's fabricated life. I gathered the stack of documents, squaring the edges meticulously against the surface of my desk. I slid the 50 pages of irrefutable evidence into a thick manila folder. This was no longer a personal vendetta. This was an active crime scene, and I was holding the murder weapon. My first instinct was to call the authorities immediately. As a licensed professional, I have a fiduciary and ethical duty to report massive financial crimes, especially when they involve federally insured banking institutions. But a colder, more calculating part of my mind intervened. If I simply handed this over to the police, my parents would inevitably find a way to spin the narrative. Brenda would claim I had somehow framed him. Jerome would hire the most expensive defense attorney he could find, likely taking out another fraudulent loan just to pay the retainer. They would circle the wagons, protect their golden child, and spend the rest of their lives painting me as the jealous, vindictive sister who destroyed the family out of spite. They needed to see it. They needed to look at the physical proof of what their blind, unwavering support had cultivated. They needed to understand that their precious son had not just stolen their retirement, he had stolen their entire future, and he was about to drag an innocent, powerful family down with him. I looked at the digital clock on my monitor. It was nearly 2 a.m. I placed the manila folder inside my leather briefcase and snapped the brass locks shut. I was not going to wait until morning. I was going to drive to my parents' house right now, wake them up, and force them to look at the monster they had created. I was going to give them one final chance to do the right thing and stop the wedding themselves. But knowing my family, I was already preparing for the worst. And if they chose to protect him, I knew exactly what I was going to do next. The drive took exactly 12 minutes. The streets of the affluent suburb were completely empty, illuminated only by the warm glow of the street lamps. Every house on this block projected an aura of absolute financial security. My parents' home was no exception. It was a sprawling colonial with pristine landscaping and a 3-car garage. To anyone driving by, it looked like the pinnacle of the American dream. But as I pulled my Porsche into the wide driveway, all I saw was a decaying facade held together by lies and maxed-out credit lines. I walked up the brick path and pressed the doorbell. I did not just press it once. I held my finger against the button until the chime echoed endlessly through the quiet house. I waited. A minute later, the porch light flicked on. The heavy oak door swung open, revealing Jerome. He was wearing expensive silk pajamas, his face twisted in a scowl of sleep-deprived annoyance. "What on earth is wrong with you, Jada?" he snapped, rubbing his eyes. "Do you have any idea what time it is?" I did not answer him. I pushed past him, stepping directly into the grand foyer. The house was aggressively over-decorated, filled with imported rugs and crystal vases that Brenda had bought specifically to impress her country club friends. I walked straight into the massive designer kitchen, the one they had completely remodeled 3 years ago, using the very first wave of their home equity loan. I dropped the heavy manila folder onto the center of the marble island. The loud smack of the leather and paper hitting the stone echoed sharply through the room. The noise woke Brenda. She hurried down the sweeping staircase, tightly wrapping her silk robe around her waist. Her hair was wrapped in a protective scarf and her face was slick with expensive night creams. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, marching into the kitchen. "Have you lost your mind coming over here and making a racket at 2 in the morning?" I stood on the opposite side of the marble island, resting my hands flat on the cold stone. I looked at both of them. I told them I had just spent the last 3 hours conducting a full forensic audit on their golden child. I opened the folder. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the calculated mechanical precision of a surgeon delivering a terminal diagnosis. I pulled out the state registry documents and slid them across the marble. I told them Nexus Global Operations was a ghost company with a virtual mailbox next to a dry cleaner. I pulled out the tax lien records and the credit card statements. I laid them out side by side. I told them I knew their retirement accounts were completely liquidated and that their house was mortgaged to the hilt. I stood back and waited for the reaction. I expected the walls to finally crumble. I expected Jerome to turn pale, to clutch his chest in horror, as he realized his life savings had been vaporized. I expected Brenda to break down into tears, devastated by the profound betrayal of her favorite son. I was prepared to step in and guide them through the grueling bankruptcy proceedings. I was prepared to help them pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. But that is not what happened. Brenda looked at the documents. She looked at the bold red text of the tax liens. And then her face hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. But the anger was not directed at Kendrick. It was directed entirely at me. She marched up to the island, raised her arm, and violently slapped the manila folder right out of my hands. The sheer force of the blow sent the heavy stack of papers exploding into the air. Dozens of printed pages fluttered down, scattering across the pristine hardwood floor like dead leaves. "How dare you!" she spat, her voice trembling with venom. "How dare you hack into our personal lives and spy on your own brother? You have always been jealous of him. You have always tried to tear him down just because he is doing bigger things than you ever will." I stared at the papers littering the floor, momentarily stunned by the sheer velocity of her delusion. I looked at Jerome. "Dad," I said, pointing to a bank statement near his foot. "You are bankrupt. He took your entire life savings to lease a Porsche and buy VIP tables at nightclubs. He is broke. You are broke." Jerome crossed his arms, puffing out his chest in a pathetic display of misplaced pride. He stepped squarely next to Brenda, forming a united front against the truth. "You do not understand high-level business, Jada," he said condescendingly. "Kendrick is about to close a massive investor deal. He just needed bridge capital. We gave him permission to use our money. It is an investment in his future. He is going to pay us back tenfold when the software launches." I listened to him regurgitate the exact same hollow buzzwords Kendrick had used at the restaurant. Bridge capital, investor deal, software launch. Jerome had no idea what any of those words actually meant. He was clinging to them like a life raft, because the alternative was admitting he had been conned by his own flesh and blood. I took a slow, deep breath. I bent down, ignoring Brenda's glaring eyes, and sifted through the scattered papers until I found the most important document in the entire stack. I stood up and placed the side-by-side forensic comparison of Roland's signature back onto the marble island. I tapped my manicured fingernail directly onto the forged ink. I told them this was no longer about their retirement fund. I told them their money had run out months ago, which was exactly why their debit card declined at the restaurant. I explained that to pay for the $150,000 wedding, they were so proud of, Kendrick had taken out a $250,000 commercial line of credit. And to get that money, he had forged Roland's signature, illegally pledging Jasmine's family trust as collateral. I looked Jerome dead in the eye and told him his son had committed federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and aggravated identity theft. I told them that when Roland found out Kendrick would not be going to a venture capital meeting, he would be going to federal prison for decades. I waited for the gravity of the word felony to sink in. I waited for the parental instinct of self-preservation to finally kick in, for the shock to override their absolute denial. Instead, Brenda scoffed. She actually rolled her eyes, waving her manicured hand at the forged signature, as if it were a minor spelling error on a dinner menu. "Oh, stop being so overly dramatic," Jada, Brenda sighed, crossing her arms and shifting her weight. "You are always trying to ruin his happiness over technicalities. He is marrying Jasmine in less than 3 months. He is marrying into Roland's family. It is basically his money anyway. They are going to share everything. Once they are married, he will just pay the loan back from their joint accounts. It is just an early advance on his inheritance." I stood completely frozen in the center of their beautiful, fraudulent kitchen. It is basically his money anyway. The sheer breathtaking entitlement of that statement echoed in my mind, drowning out the hum of the luxury refrigerator. They were not victims. They were fully complicit. They viewed Jasmine and her wealthy family not as human beings, but as a host organism for Kendrick to attach himself to. They were actively justifying the financial exploitation of an innocent woman and her father just to maintain their country club facade. They did not care that Kendrick was a criminal. They only cared that he was securing a permanent bag of wealth that they could all eventually dip their hands into. I looked at the two people who had raised me. I saw them clearly for the very first time in my 35 years of existence. There was no misunderstanding here. There was no tragic manipulation of naive elderly parents. They were just as morally bankrupt as their son. They had chosen their side. They had chosen the lie over the truth, and the golden child over the scapegoat. And in doing so, they completely severed whatever lingering emotional ties I had left to this family. The quiet, obedient daughter who wanted to save them was officially dead. The forensic accountant was the only one left in the room. I bent down in silence and began gathering the remaining pages from the floor. There was no point in arguing with people who had built a fortress out of their own delusions. I stacked the papers, tapped the edges against the marble island to align them, and slid them back into the manila folder. I told them I was leaving and that they were entirely on their own. I turned to walk out of the kitchen, but Brenda moved with a speed I did not expect. She stepped directly into my path, blocking the doorway to the foyer. The performative annoyance she had worn moments earlier was gone. Her eyes were completely dark, her jaw set in a rigid line of absolute malice. She was no longer a mother defending her son. She was a cornered accomplice, protecting her co-conspirator. "You are not going anywhere until we have an understanding," Brenda said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "You are not going to call Jasmine, you are not going to call Roland, and you are certainly not going to call the police. You are going to take your little folder, go back to your empty apartment, and keep your mouth shut." I looked at her, my face devoid of any emotion. "And if I do not?" I asked. Brenda took a step closer. She invaded my personal space, pointing a manicured finger directly at my chest. "If you try to ruin your brother's wedding," she whispered, "I will call the managing partners at your accounting firm first thing on Monday morning. I know exactly who they are. I have met them at your corporate dinners." A cold jolt of adrenaline hit my stomach, but I kept my expression perfectly still. "I will call them crying." Brenda continued, her lips curling into a cruel, triumphant smile. "I will tell them that you are having a severe psychiatric breakdown. I will tell them that you have become obsessively jealous of your brother's success, and that you are fabricating financial documents to tear our family apart. I will say we are desperately trying to get you into an inpatient psychiatric facility. Jerome stood silently by the island, watching her deliver this threat. He did not flinch. He did not intervene. He was fully supporting the destruction of my livelihood. Do you know what happens to a forensic accountant when their own mother reports them for forging financial documents out of sheer paranoia? Brenda asked, twisting the knife. They suspend you. They investigate you. Your credibility will be permanently destroyed. No client will ever trust you to audit their books again. I will ruin your entire career before lunch, Jada. Do not test me. I stood completely still, analyzing the threat with the cold logic of my profession. She was absolutely right. In the financial sector, and specifically in forensic auditing, credibility is the only currency that matters. An auditor must be above reproach. If the managing partners received a frantic, tearful call from my mother, claiming I was mentally unstable and fabricating evidence against my own family, I would be immediately placed on administrative leave. They would have to launch an internal risk assessment. Even if I eventually proved my innocence, the stain of instability would follow me forever. My career, the one thing I had built entirely on my own, the one thing that gave me independence from them, would be severely compromised. She was willing to burn my entire life to the ground just to buy Kendrick a few more months of playing pretend. The sheer calculated evil of her ultimatum finalized the death of our family bond. I was not looking at my mother anymore. I was looking at a hostile entity that actively threatened my survival. In any conflict, when the opposing force has leverage, a direct frontal assault is a tactical mistake. To defeat a narcissist, you have to feed their ego. You have to make them believe they have won. You have to give them the submission they crave so they lower their guard. I let my shoulders slump. I relaxed the rigid posture I had maintained since I walked through the door. I looked down at the marble floor, forcing my breathing to become shallow and uneven, mimicking the physical signs of panic and defeat. I let my hands shake slightly as I clutched the manila folder against my chest. When I finally looked back up at Brenda, I made sure my eyes were wide and pleading. I forced a single tear to well up and spill over my lashes. "You are right," I whispered, my voice trembling perfectly. "I am sorry. I just got so stressed looking at the numbers and I panicked. I overreacted. Please do not call my firm. It is all I have." The transformation in Brenda was instantaneous. The malicious glint in her eyes vanished, replaced by a sickening, patronizing warmth. She had successfully broken me, or so she thought. She reached out and patted my shoulder, a gesture that made my skin crawl. "I know," sweetie, Brenda sighed, adopting the tone of a benevolent, understanding mother. "We know you are just stressed and lonely. You spend too much time looking at spreadsheets. Just focus on your own life and let Kendrick handle his business. Everything is going to be perfectly fine." Jerome walked over and nodded, completely buying into my performance. "Just leave the business to the men. Jada," he said smoothly. "Go home and get some rest. We will see you at the bridal shower next month." I nodded meekly, wiping the fake tear from my cheek. I promised them I would drop the entire investigation. I promised I would not speak a word of this to Jasmine or Roland. I apologized once more for waking them up, turned around and walked out of the kitchen. I did not look back. I walked through the grand foyer, stepped out into the humid night air, and pulled the heavy oak door shut behind me. The moment the latch clicked into place, the shaking in my hands stopped. The hunched posture vanished. I stood on their pristine front porch and took a deep, cleansing breath. I felt absolutely nothing for the people inside that house. The grief of losing my parents was gone, replaced by a singular, hyper-focused objective. They thought they had neutralized the threat. They thought blackmailing me into silence meant they had won. But they had made a fatal miscalculation. They assumed my only option was to expose them verbally to the people involved. They assumed I had to rely on my voice to stop the wedding. But I am an auditor. I do not need to raise my voice to destroy a financial criminal. I just need to cut the supply lines. I walked to my car, tossed the manila folder onto the passenger seat, and started the engine. As I backed out of their driveway for the last time, my mind was already constructing the framework for a financial trap they could never escape. Brenda wanted me to stay quiet. I would gladly give her exactly what she asked for. I would not say a single word. I would not warn Jasmine. I would not warn Roland. I would simply wait for Kendrick to make his next move, and then I would use the banking system itself to detonate his life. The drive back to my apartment was quiet and peaceful. The gloves were fully off. My family was no longer a group of people I needed to protect or reason with. They were a liability, and in the corporate world, when a liability threatens to destroy your assets, you liquidate it. I knew exactly what their next move would be. The wedding was approaching fast, and despite the fraudulent line of credit, Kendrick was bleeding cash rapidly to maintain his lifestyle. The deposits for the botanical garden and the caterers were only a fraction of the total cost. He would inevitably hit a cash flow bottleneck, and when he did, Brenda would do what she always did. She would try to force me to open my wallet to cover the gap. She had specifically mentioned the bridal shower before I left. That was going to be their battleground. They were going to try and extract one last major financial contribution from me in public where I could not easily refuse without causing a scene. I parked my car in my secure garage and took the elevator up to my apartment. I walked back into my home office, the blue light of the monitors still illuminating the room. I sat down at my desk and pulled up the corporate banking portals for my firm. If they wanted me to write a check, I would write them a check. But it would be the most dangerous piece of paper they had ever touched. I was going to turn my own money into a tracking device. I was going to use their insatiable greed to trigger an automated federal freeze order. They wanted to play games with federal banking laws, so I was going to introduce them to the consequences. I set an alarm for 6 in the morning, ready to begin the final phase of my plan. I went to bed and slept better than I had in 35 years. The trap was finally sprung exactly 3 weeks before the wedding. The setting was an ultra-exclusive country club in the heart of Buckhead, the kind of establishment that required generational wealth and a board interview just to walk through the front doors. Jasmine's mother, a woman of impeccable taste and quiet authority, was hosting the bridal shower. The private solarium was drenched in natural sunlight, filled with towering displays of imported white peonies, cascading greenery, and tables draped in heavy linen. Waiters in crisp uniforms circulated with silver trays of champagne and delicate pastries. I arrived precisely on time, dressed in a tailored beige silk midi dress. I looked the part of the successful but understated older sister. My demeanor was intentionally subdued. I smiled, politely engaged in light conversation about the weather, and accepted a glass of sparkling water. I was not there to socialize. I was there on a covert reconnaissance mission, waiting for the inevitable moment my family would try to shake me down. Brenda was already there, aggressively working the room. She was wearing a brand new pale pink designer suit that I knew for a fact cost upwards of $4,000. She followed Jasmine's wealthy aunts around like a desperate shadow, laughing a fraction of a second too late at their jokes, and casually dropping fabricated details about Kendrick's tech company into every conversation. Watching her was like watching a masterclass in social climbing, built entirely on a foundation of maxed-out credit and impending federal indictments. I took a seat near the back of the room, observing the financial bleed in real time. The shower itself easily cost $10,000. Jasmine's family was picking up the tab for this event, but the sheer proximity to their wealth was clearly making Brenda and Kendrick sweat. They had to maintain the illusion that they belonged in this tax bracket. And maintaining that illusion required a constant stream of liquid cash. Halfway through the afternoon, the heavy oak doors of the solarium swung open and Kendrick walked in. It was highly unusual for the groom to make an appearance at a traditional women-only bridal shower, but Kendrick knew how to play a crowd. He was carrying a massive, obnoxious bouquet of 36 long-stem red roses. He walked straight to Jasmine, kissed her deeply, and handed her the flowers as the room erupted into a collective chorus of adoration. He played the role of the hopelessly devoted, wildly successful fiancé perfectly. But I saw right through the performance. I looked closely at his face when the crowd's attention shifted back to Jasmine. His jaw was tight. His eyes were darting nervously around the room, assessing the wealthy relatives. Beneath the custom-tailored suit and the expensive haircut, Kendrick was drowning. His fraudulent commercial line of credit was likely hitting its daily withdrawal limits, or perhaps the vendors were demanding certified bank checks rather than credit card numbers. Whatever the specific bottleneck was, he was desperate for clean, untraceable cash. And he had come to the bridal shower to extract it from me. The event transitioned to the gift opening phase. Jasmine sat in a high-backed velvet chair surrounded by a mountain of silver-wrapped boxes and expensive boutique bags. She graciously opened crystal vases, high thread-count linens, and designer kitchen appliances. Then Brenda stood up. She walked to the center of the room, picked up a silver spoon, and gently tapped it against her crystal champagne flute. The delicate ringing sound brought the room to an immediate, expectant hush. Brenda smoothed the skirt of her stolen suit and offered a warm, radiant smile to the crowd of wealthy women. "Family is the most important thing in the world to us." Brenda began, placing a hand over her heart. "We are so incredibly thrilled to welcome Jasmine into our lives. She is already like a daughter to me. And we wanted to do something truly special to mark this beautiful union. My son Kendrick is building an empire, and he works so hard to provide everything Jasmine desires. But his sister Jada wanted to contribute something highly personal." My stomach dropped, but I kept my face frozen in a pleasant, unbothered expression. I knew exactly what was coming. She was going to trap me in a social vice grip. As you all know, wedding dresses are a bride's most treasured possession. Brenda continued, her voice projecting clearly across the silent room. "Jada is so immensely proud of her brother, and she loves Jasmine so much that she has generously offered to cover the entire cost of Jasmine's custom couture bridal gown as a special sisterly gift, all $15,000 of it." The room erupted into spontaneous, delighted applause. Jasmine's aunts beamed at me. Jasmine's mother gave me an approving, elegant nod. Jasmine herself looked completely shocked, her hands flying to her mouth. She looked across the room at me, her eyes shining with genuine, unsullied gratitude. "Oh my goodness, Jada," Jasmine gasped. "That is incredibly generous. You did not have to do that. Thank you so much." I was completely boxed in. If I stood up and denied it, if I told the truth and said I had never offered to pay a single dime, I would instantly become the villain. I would humiliate Jasmine in front of her entire family, ruin the bridal shower, and look like a spiteful, insane woman who was trying to sabotage her brother's happiness. Jasmine's family would look at me with disgust. Brenda had weaponized the entire room against me. It was a masterstroke of psychological extortion. I did exactly what an auditor does when faced with an ambush. I absorbed the impact and calculated my next move. I smiled, raised my glass of sparkling water toward Jasmine, and gave a gracious nod. "It is my absolute pleasure, Jasmine," I said smoothly. "You deserve to look perfect on your big day." Brenda's face flushed with absolute triumph. She honestly thought she had won. She thought she had successfully bullied me into funding the next phase of their scam. A few minutes later, as the guests returned to their conversations and their champagne, I felt a heavy hand clamp down on my shoulder. It was Kendrick. His grip was entirely too tight, his fingers digging into my collarbone. "Let us go get some fresh air," Sister Kendrick said, his voice dripping with fake affection for the benefit of the women watching us. I stood up and allowed him to guide me through the French doors and out onto the sprawling stone terrace overlooking the golf course. The moment the glass doors clicked shut behind us, isolating us from the party, the loving brother routine vanished. Kendrick spun around to face me, his expression hardening into a look of absolute entitlement. "I need the check today," Kendrick demanded, skipping any pleasantries or fake gratitude. The bridal boutique is threatening to hold the dress alterations unless the final balance is cleared by Monday morning. They refuse to take my corporate card over the phone. They want a physical check or a direct wire transfer. I leaned back against the stone balustrade, crossing my arms defensively. I played the part of the reluctant, stressed-out sister. $15,000 is a massive amount of liquid cash to demand with zero notice. Kendrick, I said, making my voice sound strained. I cannot just write a check like that without moving funds around. Why can you not just pay them from your investor money? Kendrick stepped closer, using his physical size to try and intimidate me. Do not play games with me, Jada. You make mid-six figures. I know you have it sitting in your checking account. My funds are tied up in escrow for the software launch. I am not going to let Jasmine's dress be held hostage because you are too cheap to help out your own flesh and blood. Before I could formulate a response, the terrace doors opened again. Brenda slipped outside, ensuring the doors were tightly closed behind her. She marched directly up to me, her face pale with aggressive determination. "Stop whining and write the damn check, Jada," Brenda hissed, dropping the sweet mother persona entirely. I set that entire announcement up perfectly. You looked like a hero in there. Now you just need to follow through. I looked at my mother. I looked at the sheer desperation in her eyes. I do not have my personal checkbook with me, I said quietly. Kendrick let out a sharp, frustrated breath. Then wire it. Wire the money directly to my account right now, and I will take a cashier's check to the boutique on Monday. Pull out your phone and do it, Jada. I shook my head slowly, maintaining the illusion of resistance. I cannot just wire $15,000 to your personal account without a paper trail. It flags my own bank for unusual activity. Brenda reached out and grabbed my wrist, her manicured nails digging into my skin. Write the check, Jada. She threatened, her voice a venomous whisper. You will go home. You will write the check from your account, and you will hand it to your brother tonight. Or you are cut out of this family today. Do you hear me? If you embarrass us in front of these people, if you back out of this gift, you will never speak to us again. You will be dead to us. They were offering me an ultimatum. Pay the ransom or be excommunicated. They thought the threat of losing them would break me. They had no idea that losing them was exactly what I wanted. But I needed them to take the bait. I needed them to voluntarily accept a financial instrument that would permanently link them to my trap. I looked down at the stone floor, taking a deep, ragged breath. I let my shoulders drop in total defeat. I looked back up at them, my eyes wide and submissive. Okay, I whispered softly. Okay. I will do it. But I am not wiring it to your personal account, Kendrick. I will write a certified corporate check from my firm's escrow account. It is perfectly clean, it clears instantly, and it satisfies my accounting protocols. I will bring it to the house tonight. Kendrick smirked, his chest puffing out with victorious arrogance. He adjusted his expensive tie. See? That was not so hard, was it? Good girl. Drop it off at 8 o'clock sharp. Brenda released my wrist, smoothing the sleeve of my dress as if nothing had happened. Thank you, sweetie, she said, her voice returning to its sickeningly sweet register. I knew you would do the right thing for your family. Now let us go back inside and have some cake. They turned and walked back into the luxurious solarium, completely oblivious to the fact that they had just dug their own graves. They thought they had successfully extorted $15,000 from the family scapegoat. They did not realize that by demanding a check from my corporate escrow account, they were actively plugging themselves into a heavily monitored federal financial grid. The trap was set. All I had to do now was hand them the detonator. I stayed at the bridal shower just long enough to eat a single slice of lemon cake. I smiled politely at Jasmine, gave my gracious goodbyes to her aunts, and walked out of the country club. The valet brought my car around, and the moment I was off the property, I felt a profound sense of clarity. The heavy, suffocating weight of my family's expectations vanished in the cool afternoon air. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought public humiliation was the ultimate weapon. but they had fundamentally misunderstood the rules of the game we were playing. I drove back to my apartment and walked straight into my home office. I sat down at my desk, booted up my secure terminal, and logged into my firm's corporate banking portal. My parents and Kendrick assumed I was just going to write a personal check. They thought I was handing over my own hard-earned savings to protect their fragile social standing. But I am a forensic accountant, and I operate with specialized financial tools that ordinary people do not even know exist. I opened the ledger for a heavily monitored corporate escrow account. In the financial sector, an escrow account is essentially a secure holding zone used for corporate litigation and massive asset transfers. These accounts are scrutinized by federal regulators and subject to incredibly strict anti-money laundering protocols. Escrow funds are sacred. When a check is cut from an escrow account, the receiving banking institution is legally obligated by federal law to verify the legitimacy of the destination account. By demanding a check from my corporate escrow account, Kendrick and Brenda had forced me to do exactly what I needed to do. I was not just giving Kendrick $15,000. I was attaching a highly sensitive, federally monitored digital tracking beacon to his entire fraudulent banking ecosystem. I filled out the digital requisition form for $15,000. I authorized the release of the funds, walked over to my secure printer, and printed the certified corporate check. The paper felt heavy in my hands. It looked completely unassuming, just a standard piece of financial stationery. But it was a Trojan horse. At exactly 8 o'clock that night, I pulled my car up to my parents' house. I did not bother going inside. I did not want to breathe their air or listen to their hollow victories. I stood on the pristine front porch and rang the bell. Kendrick opened the door a few moments later. He was wearing a casual cashmere sweater and holding a glass of expensive scotch. He looked every bit the relaxed, victorious master manipulator. He had bullied his sister into submission, secured the cash to save his wedding, and maintained his fake billionaire persona. He held out his free hand, without saying a single word. I handed him the crisp white envelope containing the check. He opened it right there on the porch, pulled out the paper, and looked at the $15,000 amount. A smug, deeply arrogant chuckle escaped his lips. He noticed the corporate heading printed at the top of the check, but he clearly did not understand the legal weight behind it. He just assumed I had expensed the dress through my firm to save my own personal cash flow. "Thanks for finally being a team player," Jada Kendrick said, taking a sip of his scotch. "I knew you would come to your senses. We will see you at the rehearsal dinner." He turned around and shut the heavy oak door right in my face. I walked back to my car with a cold, genuine smile on my face. That was the last time I would ever let him speak down to me. Monday morning arrived. I sat at my terminal with my coffee watching the secure escrow ledger update in real time. At exactly 10 in the morning, the notification chimed. Kendrick had deposited the check, and he had deposited it directly into his primary business account. It was the exact same account holding the $250,000 fraudulent line of credit secured by Roland's forged signature. The trap had officially snapped shut. The financial link between my monitored account and his criminal enterprise was now established, documented, and federally verifiable. Because the funds originated from my corporate escrow, I now had the absolute legal standing as the originating auditor to flag the transaction for a mandatory review. I did not call a generic bank customer service hotline. I did not fill out a random web form. I bypassed the standard banking channels entirely. Using my industry credentials, I directly contacted the Senior Vice President of Fraud Investigations at the regional bank Kendrick was using. I drafted a highly technical, precise email. I attached the scanned copy of the deposited check to prove my legal standing in the matter. Then I attached the digital contents of the manila folder I had tried to show my parents weeks ago. I attached the state registry documents proving his company was a shell. I attached the public tax lien records showing my parents had liquidated their retirement. And finally, I attached the forensic signature comparison proving Kendrick had digitally forged Roland's signature to secure the commercial loan. I concluded the email by stating that as a licensed corporate auditor, I was legally obligated to inform them that their institution was currently harboring $250,000 in fraudulent funds and that the suspect was actively bleeding the account to pay for personal event vendors. I moved my mouse over the send button. I thought about the decades of being treated like a secondary citizen in my own family. I thought about the verbal abuse, the financial extortion, and the sheer cruelty of being banned from the wedding just days prior. I clicked send. In the corporate banking world, a fraud report of this magnitude, complete with irrefutable forensic evidence and submitted by a licensed professional, triggers an immediate and catastrophic chain reaction. But bureaucratic wheels turn at a very specific, highly predictable speed. I knew the timeline intimately. It takes compliance officers roughly 48 to 72 hours to review the submitted evidence, verify the forensic data, consult their legal department, and draft the necessary federal freeze orders. Kendrick deposited the check on a Monday morning. By Thursday evening, the bank's legal team would finalize their internal review and realize they were exposed to massive liability. But banks have very specific protocols for executing non-emergency commercial account freezes. To prevent tipping off the suspect and causing a panic withdrawal, they do not freeze accounts during peak business hours, unless a federal warrant is already active. Instead, the automated system queues the freeze order to execute on the next available weekend processing batch. That batch process runs at exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon on Saturdays. It was a masterpiece of financial timing. Kendrick would spend the entire week leading up to the wedding feeling absolutely invincible. He would use his fraudulent funds to pay the florists, the decorators, and the limousine services. He would stand at the altar on Saturday afternoon, look Jasmine in the eyes, and swear his life to her, feeling the high of getting away with the perfect con. But high-end wedding vendors operate on a very strict payment schedule. The major players, the luxury catering company providing the 5-course meal, the 12-piece live band, and the botanical garden venue itself, do not settle their final balances days in advance. They process their final event day drafts a few hours before the reception officially begins to ensure the client has the funds to cover the night's premium consumption. Kendrick had structured his entire wedding around the illusion of infinite wealth. But at exactly 4 o'clock on his wedding day, right as the guests were moving from the beautiful ceremony to the grand reception hall, the bank's automated processing batch would execute. The freeze order would lock every single penny connected to his name. His debit cards would become useless pieces of plastic. His routing numbers would be flagged by the Federal Reserve. I leaned back in my chair and watched the confirmation receipt appear in my inbox. The lead investigator had received the file. The detonator was officially armed, and the countdown had begun. For the next 5 days, I lived my life in perfect peace. I went to the gym, I worked on my other corporate audits, I ignored the frantic, demanding text messages from Brenda, reminding me about dress codes and rehearsal dinner schedules. When the groom officially banned me from the venue on the morning of the wedding, I did not argue. I let them have their hollow victory at the front gates. I handed the silver-wrapped box containing the exact same forensic files to the event coordinator, knowing it would be waiting for Kendrick at his sweetheart table. And then I drove to the steakhouse, ordered my martini, and placed my phone face up on the table. Which brings us right back to the present moment. The phone on the mahogany table had stopped vibrating with Kendrick's panicked calls. The group chat had received the screenshot of the federal freeze order. The silence in my booth was absolute. I took another sip of my coffee, savoring the rich, dark flavor. I knew the chaos unfolding across town was biblical. The caterers were refusing to plate the food. The band was packing up their instruments. Kendrick was likely standing in the middle of his $150,000 reception, completely powerless as the illusion he had sacrificed his own family to build shattered into a million pieces. The door to the steakhouse swung open, letting in a brief flash of the late afternoon Georgia sun. I looked up. A tall, impeccably dressed older man walked into the dim restaurant. His face was a mask of cold, terrifying fury. He did not look like a man whose daughter had just gotten married. He looked like a man who was ready to destroy a life. It was Roland, Jasmine's father, and he was walking straight toward my booth. He moved with the heavy, deliberate strides of a man who was used to commanding boardrooms and destroying corporate rivals. His expensive tuxedo was still perfectly pressed, but the black silk bow tie had been untied, hanging loosely around the collar of his crisp white shirt. The festive white floral boutonniere pinned to his lapel felt like a mocking, absurd contrast to the absolute thundercloud of rage darkening his features. He did not ask for permission to join me. He slid into the curved leather booth directly across the table, his physical presence instantly dominating the quiet space. He signaled the bartender with a sharp, authoritative flick of his wrist. 2 fingers of bourbon neat, he ordered his deep baritone cutting through the ambient jazz music, playing softly from the overhead speakers. I did not flinch. I did not offer a polite deferential greeting. I simply looked at him, waiting for the opening move in this incredibly high-stakes chess match. I had just detonated a financial nuclear bomb in the middle of his daughter's wedding, completely humiliating his family in front of Atlanta's political and social elite. By all standard social conventions, he should have been screaming at me. But Roland was not a standard man. The bartender approached quickly, delivering the heavy crystal glass. Roland picked it up, took a slow measured sip, and set it down precisely on the center of the linen coaster. His dark, penetrating eyes locked onto mine, searching for any sign of intimidation or guilt. He found neither. "I assume you are the one who put the silver box on the table," Roland said quietly. I met his gaze with absolute professional neutrality. "Yes, sir," I replied. "I am." Roland nodded slowly, absorbing the confirmation. He leaned back against the dark leather upholstery, studying me as if he were looking at a completely different person than the quiet, submissive sister he had met at the engagement dinner 3 months ago. "You are a forensic accountant," he stated. It was not a question. It was the realization of a man who had finally read the fine print on a highly destructive contract. Senior Level 1 corrected him smoothly. "I specialize in corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and hidden asset tracing." A sharp, bitter chuckle escaped his lips. It held absolutely zero humor. "Of course you are," he muttered. "Your mother spent the entire engagement dinner telling anyone who would listen that you were basically a glorified bookkeeper. She painted you as this bitter, boring woman who was violently jealous of her brother's massive success. And all the while, you were the only person in the room who actually knew how to read a balance sheet." "My mother has a very complicated relationship with the truth," I said, taking a sip of my cold coffee. "She prefers the reality she invents over the one she actually lives in." Roland rubbed his hand over his jaw, the sound of the friction loud in the quiet booth. "I never liked him, you know. Kendrick. From the moment Jasmine brought him home, my instincts were screaming that something was fundamentally wrong with the boy. He was too slick. He used too many buzzwords. He wore suits that cost more than my first car. But he could not answer a single basic question about supply chain logistics without pivoting to some vague philosophical nonsense about synergy. "Why did you let her marry him then?" I asked directly. It was a bold question, but the rules of polite society had been entirely suspended the moment Kendrick forged this man's signature. Roland sighed, the heavy, exhausted sound of a father who had been outmaneuvered by his child's heart. "Because Jasmine loved him, and because Jasmine has always been fiercely independent. If I had hired a private investigator to dig into his background, and she found out, she would have viewed it as a massive betrayal of her trust. She would have dug her heels in and married him anyway, just to prove me wrong. I needed her to see it for herself. But God help me, Jada, I never imagined the deception ran this deep. I thought he was just a gold digger. I did not realize he was a federal criminal." I shifted my posture, folding my hands on the mahogany table. "Have you contacted your legal team yet?" Roland's eyes hardened, the brief vulnerability of a father instantly replaced by the ruthless calculation of a real estate titan. My general counsel is already drafting the federal fraud reports. We have an executive contact at the regional bank. They confirmed the commercial line of credit was frozen at exactly 4 o'clock this afternoon, pending an internal investigation, which I am assuming was also your doing. I nodded. I established a secure paper trail through my firm's escrow account on Monday. The automated compliance freeze was scheduled for this afternoon. It was the only way to ensure the bank's legal department stepped in before he could liquidate the remaining funds and disappear with your daughter. Roland stared at me, a profound look of respect washing over his face. You did not just expose him, Jada. You dismantled him. You used the federal banking system to build a cage, and you locked the door while he was standing at the altar. It was a terrifyingly brilliant piece of corporate sabotage. It was not sabotage, Roland. It was an audit. I just delivered the final report. He picked up his glass and finished the rest of his bourbon in one swift motion. He set the glass down with a heavy thud that rattled the silverware. Well, your final report caused a localized earthquake. I have spent the last 30 years navigating aggressive corporate takeovers, cutthroat politicians, and ruthless developers. But I have never seen a man's life implode as quickly and violently as your brother's just did. I kept my face perfectly neutral, but a small spark of deep vindicating satisfaction ignited in my chest. I had spent weeks mapping out the exact moment the illusion would shatter, but hearing it confirmed by the man who had witnessed it firsthand was entirely different. Tell me what happened, I said quietly. Roland leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. The anger in his eyes was still there, but now it was laced with a dark, grim satisfaction. He wanted to tell the story just as much as I wanted to hear it. The ceremony went off without a hitch. Roland began, his voice low and steady. It was beautiful. Jasmine looked radiant. Your parents were sitting in the front row, practically glowing with smug pride. Kendrick said his vows. He promised to honor, protect, and cherish her. He looked me right in the eye when he said it. The sheer sociopathy of the boy is actually breathtaking. I know, I replied. He has been practicing that mask his entire life. We moved from the gardens into the grand reception hall, Roland continued. The guests were finding their seats. The band was warming up. The waitstaff was preparing to serve the first course. Kendrick and Jasmine were sitting at the sweetheart table posing for the photographers. And right there, sitting dead center on his plate, was a sleek silver-wrapped box. Did the coordinator tell him who it was from? I asked. She did not have to, Roland said with a grim smile. Jasmine saw it first. She thought it was a special wedding day gift from him. She urged him to open it. Kendrick picked it up, looking slightly confused, but he played along for the cameras. He pulled the ribbon. He tore the silver paper. He opened the lid. Roland paused, shaking his head slowly as the memory played out in his mind. I was standing about 10 feet away talking to my brother. I watched Kendrick reach into the box and pull out a thick manila folder. I watched him open it and look at the first page. And I prompted, keeping my voice steady. And it was like watching a man step on a landmine, Roland said quietly. All the blood completely drained from his face. His jaw went slack. His hands started shaking so violently that the papers rattled. He looked like he was about to vomit right there on the white linen tablecloth. Jasmine asked him what was wrong. She reached out to touch his arm, and he actually flinched away from her, clutching the folder to his chest, like a physical shield. Right on schedule, I noted. But that was only the beginning, Roland said, leaning closer. Because exactly 5 seconds after he opened that folder, the venue's head event coordinator came rushing out of the kitchen. She looked absolutely panicked. She bypassed the wedding planner entirely and practically ran up to the sweetheart table. She leaned down and whispered something directly into Kendrick's ear. The auto drafts bounced, I said, confirming the timeline. Every single one of them, Roland confirmed. The coordinator told him the catering company's final $35,000 transaction had been declined by the bank. She told him the band's agency had just called the venue office, stating their retainer draft was blocked due to a federal fraud hold on his routing number. The entire vendor ecosystem collapsed in the span of 3 minutes. What did my parents do? I asked. I was incredibly curious to know how Brenda and Jerome reacted when their golden child's empire went up in flames in front of 200 people. Roland let out a harsh, mocking laugh. Your mother noticed the commotion immediately. She rushed over to the sweetheart table, physically pushing past the photographers. She started yelling at the coordinator, demanding to know why she was bothering the groom on his special day. She started pulling out her own credit cards, telling the staff she would handle whatever minor accounting error had occurred. She thought she could cover it, I said, shaking my head at the absolute absurdity of her delusion. She thought it was just another declined dinner bill. Exactly, Roland said. She was completely frantic, waving her plastic cards around. But she did not realize that a federal freeze order is not a simple declined card. It is a total financial quarantine. And then before your mother could make an even bigger fool of herself, Jasmine reached over and pulled the manila folder right out of Kendrick's paralyzed hands. Jasmine pulled the folder right out of his hands, Roland said, a deep sense of pride threading through his rough voice. Kendrick tried to grab it back. He actually reached for her, babbling some absolute nonsense about a corporate misunderstanding and a temporary glitch in his business accounts. But Jasmine took 2 steps back, completely out of his reach. She opened the folder right there in front of the sweetheart table, standing in her custom gown, and she started reading. I leaned forward slightly, resting my chin on my folded hands. Did she understand what she was looking at? I asked. Roland offered a sharp, humorless smile. She is my daughter Jada. She has been sitting in on my real estate board meetings since she was 16 years old. She knows exactly how to read a uniform commercial code filing. She looked at the first page, which was the digital freeze order you triggered. Then she flipped to the second page. The signature comparison, I said softly. Exactly, Roland confirmed. She saw the side-by-side forensic breakdown of my actual signature and the digital forgery he used to secure the $250,000 loan against her own family trust. I watched her eyes track across the paper. I watched the realization hit her. She did not cry. She did not scream. Her face just turned into absolute stone. She flipped to the next page and saw the state registry proving his tech company was a hollow shell. Then she saw the tax liens. She saw the drained retirement accounts of your parents. She saw the entire pathetic reality of the man she had just married laid out in black and white. And right as she was processing all of this, Roland continued. The reality of the frozen accounts hit the ballroom floor. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the image. Tell me about the vendors, I said. It was unprecedented, Roland said, shaking his head. I have attended hundreds of high society events in my life, and I have never seen a venue shut down a party with such ruthless efficiency. The head event coordinator marched out of the kitchen, flanked by the catering director. They did not even try to be discreet. They instructed the waitstaff to stop the service immediately. Waiters literally walked up to the tables and pulled the plates of filet mignon right out from under the guests. I could picture it perfectly. The clattering of heavy silver forks hitting fine china, the confused murmurs of 200 wealthy politicians, socialites, and corporate executives as their expensive dinners were abruptly confiscated. For a family like mine, a family entirely obsessed with appearances and social climbing, it was the ultimate, inescapable nightmare. And the band, I prompted. Roland let out a low chuckle. The band was the nail in the coffin. The band leader walked up to the microphone in the center of the dance floor. He tapped it twice, getting the attention of the entire room. Then he announced over the venue's massive sound system that the groom's final payment drafts had bounced, and they were contractually obligated to cease their performance due to non-payment. The string quartet stopped playing mid-measure. The brass section packed up their horns. The venue staff walked over to the walls and flipped the overhead maintenance lights on, flooding the romantic, dimly lit ballroom with harsh, unforgiving fluorescent light. It was the universal signal that the party was over. "What did Brenda do?" I asked, already knowing my mother would have chosen the most embarrassing possible reaction. "Your mother completely lost her mind," Roland said, his expression twisting with absolute disgust. "She started screaming at the venue staff. She threatened to sue the caterers. She threatened to sue the band. She pulled her designer handbag off her chair and started frantically digging for her credit cards, loudly declaring that she would pay for the entire wedding right then and there because her family was good for it. She had no idea her own accounts were empty," I noted. She handed the catering director a platinum card, Roland said. The director pulled out a mobile point-of-sale tablet, swiped the card right in front of her, and showed her the bright red declined message on the screen. "Your mother went totally silent. Your father looked like he was going to pass out." They were standing under the harsh fluorescent lights, completely exposed to the entire room. 200 people were staring at them, whispering, pointing, and watching the illusion of their massive wealth evaporate into thin air. "And Kendrick?" I asked. Roland leaned back, swirling the last drop of bourbon in his glass. "Kendrick was on his knees, literally on his knees, begging my daughter. But he was not apologizing for the fraud. He was not apologizing for stealing my identity or draining his parents dry. He was begging Jasmine to keep her voice down. He was begging her to smile, to pretend everything was fine, until the guests left to preserve his image. He cared more about what my political colleagues thought of him than he cared about the fact that he had just destroyed his own life." Jasmine looked down at him. Roland said, his voice filling with fierce parental pride. She held up the manila folder and dropped it directly onto his chest. Then she reached down to her left hand. She grabbed the 3-carat diamond engagement ring he had given her. "The ring he bought using the money he stole from either me or your parents." She took it off, I said. A wave of genuine respect for Jasmine washing over me. "She pulled it off her finger," Roland confirmed. "She looked him dead in the eye and said she was annulling the marriage first thing Monday morning. Then she threw the ring directly at his face. It hit his cheekbone, bounced off his chest, and rolled away across the empty dance floor. Nobody even tried to pick it up." Roland took a deep breath, smoothing the lapels of his tuxedo. After that, Jasmine turned around, gathered the train of her custom silk gown, and walked straight down the center aisle of the reception hall. She did not look back once. She walked right out the front doors of the botanical garden and got into a waiting town car. I sat back in my leather booth, absorbing the sheer magnitude of the destruction. It was flawless. The trap had executed exactly as I designed it. I had used my firm's escrow check to link his accounts, triggered the federal freeze order to hit right before the vendor drafts, and provided the documentary evidence precisely when he could not hide from it. I stepped in after Jasmine left, Roland said, bringing my attention back to the present. I walked to the center of the room and addressed my side of the guest list. I thanked them for their time, apologized for the abrupt conclusion of the evening, and instructed my family to head to the exits. Within 10 minutes, the entire hall was empty. "You left them there," I said. I left Kendrick, Brenda, and Jerome standing in a massive empty ballroom, surrounded by angry venue managers, unpaid caterers, and security guards threatening to call the local police for theft of services, Roland replied smoothly. "It was not my mess to clean up." Roland reached into his tailored jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek leather wallet. He threw a $100 bill onto the table to cover his bourbon. He looked at me, the anger in his eyes fully replaced by a cold, calculating respect. "I am going to the district attorney's office on Monday morning," Roland stated. "I am bringing my corporate legal team, and I am formally pressing federal charges for wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. I am going to make sure your brother spends a very long time in a federal penitentiary." I gave him a single definitive nod. "Good. He deserves every single second of it." Roland stood up from the booth. He adjusted his suit jacket, looking down at me. "You are a terrifying woman, Jada," he said quietly. "And I mean that as the highest possible compliment. You protected my daughter from making the biggest mistake of her life, and you took down a parasite in the process. If you ever decide to leave your current firm and want to run the forensic division for my real estate empire, My door is always open. Thank you, Roland, I said. I will keep that in mind. Give Jasmine my best. Tell her I am sorry it had to happen this way, but it had to happen. He nodded once, turned on his heel, and walked out of the dim steakhouse, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The restaurant was quiet again. The jazz music hummed softly in the background. My phone, still sitting face down on the table, was completely silent. The fallout of the wedding was over. The public execution of Kendrick's fake empire was complete. But I knew my family. I knew the profound depths of their denial and the viciousness of their entitlement. They had just suffered the most catastrophic public humiliation of their entire lives. They were currently sitting in the ruins of a $150,000 party they could not pay for, surrounded by the ashes of their social standing. They were not going to accept this quietly. They were not going to reflect on their actions, realize their mistakes, and apologize to me. Narcissists do not process defeat that way. They process it as a personal attack, and they seek a target to project their massive failures onto. I picked up my phone and turned it over. The screen was flooded with missed calls and voicemails, dozens from Brenda, dozens from Jerome, dozens from Kendrick. I did not listen to a single one of them. I cleared the notifications, paid my bill, and walked out to my car. As I drove back to my secure apartment building, I mentally prepared myself for the final confrontation. They had survived the night, but the morning was coming. And when the sun rose, they were going to show up at my door, desperate, angry, and demanding that I fix the catastrophic mess they had created. They thought the wedding was the climax of this war. They had no idea I was holding one final devastating piece of paper. I woke up on Sunday morning to the soft hum of my espresso machine and the bright Georgia sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my apartment. The air in my home felt lighter, completely devoid of the suffocating anxiety that had plagued me for the last 3 months. I poured myself a cup of dark roast coffee, walked over to my kitchen island, and looked at my phone. I had kept it on silent all night. The screen displayed 47 missed calls and a barrage of unread text messages, all from my parents and Kendrick. I did not read a single one. I simply deleted the notification threads, set the phone down, and took a sip of my coffee. I knew they would not settle for voicemails. At exactly 9 in the morning, the intercom on my wall buzzed. It was the lobby concierge. He sounded highly uncomfortable as he informed me that my parents and my brother were standing at the front desk demanding to be led up to my floor and threatening to call the police if they were denied entry. I calmly told the concierge that no police were necessary and authorized him to send them up. I unlocked my front door and left it slightly ajar. 2 minutes later, the door swung open. The 3 people who walked into my living room were practically unrecognizable from the arrogant, condescending family that had tried to extort me at the country club just 3 weeks prior. The polished high society masks had been completely stripped away, leaving only raw, unfiltered panic. Kendrick looked like a ghost. He was still wearing the black trousers from his custom wedding tuxedo, but his shirt was wrinkled, unbuttoned at the collar, and stained with sweat. His eyes were bloodshot, and his hands were trembling so badly he had to shove them deep into his pockets just to hide the shaking. Jerome looked 10 years older, his shoulders slumped in defeat, his face pale and drawn. But Brenda was the most striking. The immaculate, composed mother of the groom was gone. Her hair was disheveled. She was wearing a mismatched sweatsuit, and the designer handbag she clutched so tightly to her chest looked like a shield. She did not march in with her usual haughty entitlement. She walked in like a cornered animal. Nobody said a word for a long, heavy moment. They just stood in the entryway of my pristine apartment, looking at the calm, collected woman they had spent decades underestimating. I leaned against the kitchen counter, holding my coffee mug with both hands. "Good morning," I said, my voice perfectly level. "I assume the reception ended early." The sound of my calm voice acted like a match dropped into a powder keg. Brenda practically lunged forward, her face twisting with a mixture of terror and rage. "Roland called us this morning. she gasped, her voice cracking under the strain. He called us at 7 o'clock. He is going to the federal prosecutor tomorrow, Jada. He is handing over the files you gave him. He is pressing federal charges against your brother. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I know, I replied simply. I met with him yesterday afternoon while you were dealing with the caterers. He has a very solid case. Kendrick let out a choked, pathetic sound. He collapsed onto my expensive leather sofa, burying his face in his hands. I am going to prison, he sobbed, the reality of his actions finally crushing his massive ego. It is federal wire fraud. The minimum sentence is years, Jada. Years in a federal penitentiary. My life is completely over. Jerome stepped forward, his hands raised in a desperate pleading gesture. Jada, please, he begged, his voice shaking. We know you are angry. We know we have made mistakes in how we treated you. But this is family. This is your blood. You cannot let him go to prison. You are the only one who actually understands these financial laws. You have to fix this. I set my coffee mug down on the granite counter. The sharp click of the ceramic echoed in the quiet room. I cannot fix a crime that has already been committed, Jerome, I said coldly. The bank has the forged documents. The commercial line of credit is frozen under a federal hold. The money he stole from your retirement accounts is gone. The money he tried to steal from Jasmine's family is locked. There is no accounting trick in the world that erases aggravated identity theft. Brenda slammed her handbag down on my kitchen island. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. You started this, she screamed, completely abandoning any pretense of an apology. You are the one who triggered the bank freeze. You are the one who printed out those files and put them in that silver box. You ruined his wedding and you destroyed his life out of pure jealousy. I looked at my mother, marveling at the sheer, indestructible fortress of her delusion. Even now, standing in the rubble of her son's criminal enterprise, she still needed a villain to blame. She still refused to hold him accountable. Kendrick ruined his own life the moment he decided to forge a signature on a $250,000 loan. I corrected her, my voice turning to ice. I just turned the lights on so everyone else could see what he was doing in the dark. Brenda ignored my logic completely. She stepped closer, her eyes wide and manic. You work in the corporate sector, she demanded. You know the best white-collar criminal defense attorneys in Atlanta, the ones who handle federal fraud cases. We need the best legal team in the state. I crossed my arms. And how exactly do you plan on paying for a top-tier federal defense attorney, Brenda? Those lawyers charge $100,000 just for the initial retainer. Your bank accounts are empty. Your credit cards are maxed out. Your debit card declined for a $2,000 dinner. You are completely bankrupt. Brenda's face flushed with a desperate, aggressive heat. That is why we are here, Jada. You make a massive salary. You have savings. You have investments. You have the money. You are going to write a check for the retainer today. You have to save your brother. The absolute audacity of her demand hung in the air, so heavy and toxic, it was almost suffocating. Less than 24 hours ago, she had banned me from the botanical gardens, treating me like a peasant who was not worthy of breathing the same air as her golden child. Now, facing the catastrophic consequences of their own actions, she was demanding that I drain my own hard-earned wealth to buy a legal shield for a federal criminal. I let out a slow, dark chuckle. It was not a laugh of amusement. It was the sound of a woman who had finally realized how deeply pathetic her abusers truly were. You want me to pay for his defense? I asked, looking directly at Kendrick, who was still weeping into his hands on my couch. You want me to fund the legal team for the man who stole my graduation money, who used my credit to clean up his messes, and who stood at the gates of his wedding yesterday and mocked me for being a spinster? He is your brother. Jerome yelled, his face turning purple with helpless rage. We are your family. We raised you. You owe us. I do not owe you a single damn thing. I fired back, my voice finally rising to meet theirs, carrying the weight of 35 years of suppressed anger. You did not raise a daughter, Jerome. You raised a safety net. You spent my entire life telling me my career was boring and meaningless while you worshipped a man who was actively stealing your retirement. You let him bleed you dry, and when he ran out of your money, you enabled him to steal from an innocent family. And now that he got caught, you want me to write a blank check to make the consequences go away. I walked around the kitchen island, closing the distance between myself and my mother. Brenda actually took a step back, intimidated by the sheer intensity radiating from me. I am not giving you a single dime, I stated with absolute unwavering finality. I am not hiring a lawyer. I am not making any phone calls on his behalf. I am not going to help you. When the federal marshals come to arrest him, I will not be there to post his bail. Kendrick looked up from his hands, his face wet with tears and snot. Jada, please. He begged, his voice breaking into a pathetic whine. I just wanted to give Jasmine the wedding she deserved. I was going to pay the loan back. I swear to God I was going to pay it back once the company launched. You have to believe me. You do not have a company, Kendrick, I snapped, cutting through his lies with surgical precision. You have a virtual mailbox next to a dry cleaner. You are a fraud. And the only reason you are crying right now is because Jasmine's father has enough money and power to ensure you actually serve your sentence. Brenda let out a guttural scream of absolute frustration. She grabbed her handbag from the counter, her eyes blazing with a toxic mixture of hatred and desperation. Fine, she spat, her chest heaving. If you are going to be this selfish, if you are going to turn your back on your own blood when we need you the most, then we will do it ourselves. We do not need your money. Jerome looked at her, his eyes wide with confusion. Brenda? What are you talking about? We have nothing left. We have the house, Brenda declared, lifting her chin with a defiant, tragic arrogance. We have the Colonial. It is worth over $1 million in this market. We will call a broker tomorrow morning. We will sell the house, or we will take out another massive equity loan against it. We will use the house to pay for Kendrick's defense team. We will save our son, and you can rot in this lonely apartment by yourself. She grabbed Jerome by the arm, yanking him toward the front door. Come on, Jerome. Kendrick, get up. We are leaving. We are going home to fix this ourselves. We do not need her. They turned toward the door, wrapping themselves in their final desperate illusion. They truly believed they still had one last asset to sacrifice on the altar of Kendrick's ego. They believed they still had a home to return to. I watched them take 3 steps toward the exit before I spoke. I reached into the deep pocket of my silk robe. My fingers brushed against the crisp edge of the thick manila envelope I had prepared the night before. You cannot use the house, Brenda, I said quietly. Brenda stopped in her tracks. She slowly turned around, her hand resting on the brass doorknob, her eyes narrowed in suspicion. And why exactly cannot I use my own house, Jada? I pulled the envelope from my pocket. Because I replied, my voice perfectly steady, you do not own it anymore. Jerome froze, his hand still resting on the brass doorknob of my apartment. He turned his head slowly, his eyes narrowing in a mixture of deep confusion and rising panic. He looked at Brenda, then back at me. What do you mean we do not own it? He asked, his voice completely devoid of the aggressive bluster he had carried just moments before. We have lived in that house for 30 years. Our names are on the deed. I took 2 steps forward and held out the thick manila envelope. Jerome hesitated for a fraction of a second before reaching out and taking it. His hands were shaking just as badly as Kendrick's. I watched him open the clasp and slide the heavy stack of legal documents out into the open. I did not raise my voice. I delivered the facts with the exact same clinical precision I use when presenting evidence in a corporate boardroom. When you took out that massive home equity line of credit to fund Kendrick's fake lifestyle, you apparently stopped paying attention to the actual mortgage, I explained smoothly. The bank sent you multiple warning letters. They sent you default notices. You either ignored them or Kendrick intercepted them in the mail so you would not cut off his cash flow. Exactly 60 days ago, the bank officially placed the property into pre-foreclosure status. It became a matter of public record. Jerome was staring at the papers in his hands, his eyes darting frantically across the dense legal paragraphs. The color completely drained from his face as he read the bold headings. When a premium property goes into pre-foreclosure, the bank is usually highly motivated to offload the distressed debt before it goes to a public auction. I continued taking another sip of my coffee, so I contacted the bank's asset management division. I formed a blind corporate limited liability company to mask my identity. I paid off your massive arrears in cash, assumed the remaining debt, and purchased the property outright. The deed transfer was finalized and recorded with the county clerk last week. Brenda snatched the papers out of Jerome's hands. She stared at the signature lines, her mouth opening and closing silently as her brain desperately tried to process the sheer magnitude of her defeat. "You cannot do this," Brenda finally gasped, her voice shrill and breathy. "You cannot just steal our home." "I did not steal anything, Brenda," I replied coldly. "I saved it from being auctioned off to a random real estate developer. But more importantly, I secured my own financial future. You see, I knew this exact moment was coming. I knew that the second Kendrick's fraudulent empire collapsed, you would try to liquidate your only remaining asset to save him. I knew you would sell the house that I grew up in, just to pay for a criminal defense attorney for a man who belongs in prison. I bought the house to make absolutely sure you could not do that." Kendrick let out a loud, agonizing groan from the sofa. He dropped his head between his knees, realizing that his final lifeline had just been violently severed. There was no money for a high-powered lawyer. There was no secret fund. He was going to have to face the full wrath of Roland's corporate legal team with a public defender. Brenda looked at me, her eyes filling with a terrifying, hollow despair. She finally realized that the daughter she had spent decades treating like a secondary citizen was the one holding the absolute power over her life. She took a trembling step toward me. "Jada, please," she whispered, the arrogance entirely stripped away. "Where are we supposed to go? What are we supposed to do?" "Look at the second document in that stack," I instructed her. Brenda flipped the deed transfer over. Beneath it was a formal, legally binding piece of paper printed on official county letterhead. "That is a 30-day notice to vacate the premises," I told them, my voice hardening into absolute steel. "You have exactly 1 month to pack up your designer clothes, your imported rugs, and whatever dignity you have left and get out of my property." Jerome looked up at me, his eyes wide with utter disbelief. "You are evicting your own parents. You are throwing us out on the street." I walked over to the front door of my apartment. I grabbed the brass handle, pulled the heavy door wide open, and stepped aside, gesturing out into the hallway. "You spent my entire life telling me that my only value was my financial utility to this family," I said, looking Jerome dead in the eye. "You demanded my savings to fix Kendrick's mistakes. You demanded my corporate accounts to fund his fake wedding. You said I was just a wallet to this family. Well, the wallet is officially closed. Get out of my home." For a long, excruciating moment, nobody moved. The reality of their absolute destruction settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. There were no more threats to make. There was no more leverage to exploit. I had outmaneuvered them on every single front, legally, financially, and emotionally. Jerome was the first to break. He lowered his head, a broken man who had sacrificed his entire life for a son who was nothing but a mirage. He walked slowly out the door, not saying a single word. Kendrick followed him, dragging his feet across the hardwood floor, keeping his eyes firmly glued to the ground. He did not look at me. He knew if he did, he would only see the reflection of his own pathetic failure. Brenda was the last to leave. She stood in the doorway, clutching her designer handbag, looking at my perfectly clean, peaceful apartment. She opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to launch one final venomous insult, or perhaps to offer a desperate apology. But I did not give her the chance. I looked at her with complete, unbothered indifference. "Goodbye, Brenda," I said softly. I shut the door, the heavy lock clicking securely into place. The silence that followed was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. 6 months have passed since that Sunday morning. The fallout was exactly as severe and unforgiving as I had predicted. Roland did not hesitate. He marched into the federal prosecutor's office on Monday morning with his army of corporate lawyers and handed over the entire forensic file I had compiled. The evidence was so irrefutable, so perfectly documented, that the authorities moved with terrifying speed. Kendrick was arrested by federal marshals 3 days later. His public defender took one look at the digital signature forgeries, the fraudulent escrow deposits, and the fake corporate filings, and immediately advised him to take a plea deal. Kendrick pled guilty to 1 count of federal wire fraud and 1 count of aggravated identity theft. The judge was not moved by his tears or his apologies. My brother is currently serving a 3-year sentence in a minimum security federal penitentiary in Florida. He spends his days working in the prison laundry, stripped of his bespoke suits and his imaginary tech empire. My parents fared no better. When the 30-day eviction notice expired, they had no choice but to pack up 30 years of memories into a rented moving truck. Because their credit scores were completely destroyed and their retirement accounts were empty, they could not qualify for a mortgage. They are currently renting a tiny, cramped 1-bedroom apartment in a highly undesirable part of the city. The social exile was even worse than the financial ruin. Roland made sure everyone in their affluent social circle knew exactly what Kendrick had done. My parents were quietly but firmly asked to resign from their exclusive country club. Their wealthy friends stopped returning their calls. The illusion of their superiority shattered, leaving them completely alone with the bitter reality of the choices they had made. As for Jasmine, she proved to be one of the strongest women I have ever met. She filed for an annulment the very next morning, citing criminal fraud. Because the marriage was based entirely on a fabricated identity, the judge granted it immediately. She did not let the humiliation break her. Instead, she threw herself back into her philanthropic work. Surprisingly, Jasmine and I stayed in touch. A few weeks after the wedding disaster, she sent a massive bouquet of orchids to my office with a handwritten note thanking me for saving her from a life tied to a sociopath. We occasionally meet up for lunch when I am downtown. We do not talk about Kendrick. We talk about our careers, our travels, and our plans for the future. She is thriving, and I am genuinely grateful to call her a friend. Which brings me to today. I am currently sitting on a private balcony overlooking the pristine white sands and crystal clear waters of Cabo San Lucas. A warm tropical breeze is rustling the palm trees below, and I have a perfectly chilled margarita resting on the table beside me. I took a month of paid leave from my accounting firm to travel, decompress, and fully embrace the absolute freedom of my new life. I opened my laptop this morning to check my financial portfolios. They are completely untouched by my family's greed. The house I bought from the bank is currently being rented out to a lovely young couple, generating a steady stream of passive income. I am secure, I am successful, and most importantly, I am completely at peace. Society constantly pushes the narrative that blood is thicker than water. We are told that we must endure endless abuse, financial extortion, and psychological manipulation simply because the people hurting us share our DNA. We are conditioned to be the bigger person to keep the peace and to set ourselves on fire just to keep our toxic family members warm. But I am here to tell you that true peace only comes when you are willing to walk away from the people who refuse to respect your boundaries. You do not owe your success to people who treat you like a stepping stone. You do not owe your loyalty to people who use it as a weapon against you. Sometimes the most powerful act of self-love you can ever commit is letting the trash take itself out while you stand quietly in the background holding the receipts. Have you ever had to cut off a toxic family member to protect your own future? Have you ever had to stop being the family safety net and start living for yourself? I would love to hear your stories of survival and independence in the comments below. If this journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to hear more authentic stories of resilience, justice, and growth. And if you know someone who is currently struggling with a family that underestimates their worth, share this video with them as a reminder that their life belongs entirely to them. Thank you for letting me share my story. Keep protecting your peace, keep building your empire, and never apologize for outsmarting the people who tried to break you.